Tyrion Lannister drained the last drops of arbor gold from his cup and set it aside with a trembling hand. The wine's sweetness clung to his tongue, yet the taste he was left with in his mouth was bitter. Lord Varys had visited him in the dead of night to deliver a parchment containing testimonies, lists of names and coded messages, then vanished as quickly as he had come. The spider's parting words still echoed in Tyrion's mind. "Use it wisely, my lord, and carefully." He could still picture the faint candlelight reflecting off Varys's pale face, the half-smile playing on the Master of Whisperers' lips as he laid out the documents. There was no question, not anymore, about what Tyrion had suspected for years but only in the darkest corners of his mind dared to articulate. Tywin Lannister, his father, was responsible for unspeakable deeds beyond even what the realm's rumor mills dared whisper. There were war crimes nestled in the pages, hidden behind the official records. Villages razed without reason, lords bribed into false confessions, and a hush kept over the brutal murders of entire families during the war. No matter how cunningly Tywin had tried to bury every scrap of evidence behind subordinates or scapegoats, here it was, unvarnished truth on scraped parchment that stank of spilled blood. Tyrion felt the weight of it pressing down on him, heavier than any golden chain around his neck. There in his solar, with only the flickering oil lamp for company, he read until the flames guttered and the room grew chill with approaching dawn. The confessions detailed Tywin's complicity in atrocities that had never before reached the light. Fresh details of old events slithered through Tyrion's mind like serpents. The sack of King's Landing had been an open horror, everyone knew, but not everyone knew of the summarily executed innocents Tywin had ordered snuffed out in the aftermath. And that was only one piece. Tywin's secret letters to mercenary companies, commanding them to pillage under other banners so that no blame would return to the Golden Lion. Correspondences with bannermen who had grown uneasy in time of peace and needed a show of force. Threats delivered to families with known sympathies to other great houses. The list went on like a never-ending dirge. Tyrion, who had endured a lifetime of his father's coldness, felt outrage burning low in his stomach. Yet he was no fool. Exposing Tywin Lannister would be akin to leaping off a cliff. No matter how well Tyrion planned his landing, he risked being dashed on the rocks below. House Lannister's power was gargantuan. The gold of Casterly Rock bought armies, fleets, loyalty, and silence. Their name was still enough to strike fear into lords across the Seven Kingdoms. Even now, the Iron Throne was in debt to them. Yet Tyrion felt, with a clarity that both buoyed him and terrified him, that the days of living under Tywin's oppressive shadow had reached a breaking point. For years, Tywin had systematically built a fearsome reputation, forging alliances and forcing foes into submission. People did not necessarily love the Lion of the Rock, but they respected the might he wielded. In corners of the realm, there was talk that Tywin was the true power behind the throne, no matter who happened to occupy the seat of kingship at any given moment. Tyrion's father had taught him a crucial lesson. Fear trumps respect when it has more teeth. And indeed, Tywin's fearsome policies had served the Lannisters well, providing wealth and security to their bannermen, at a monstrous moral cost. Tyrion felt his heart flutter as he weighed the risk. Was it worth it, to see House Lannister undone, to see its sigil and name disgraced in the eyes of the entire realm, all in the pursuit of justice for victims most of Westeros had never met or heard of? Could he truly become kinslayer in all but name, the kind of son who destroyed the father? If Tywin were not brought down, who would pay for these crimes? The memories of innocents who had no avenger? Tyrion ran his hands over his stubble-covered cheeks and realized he was quite sober indeed. No quantity of arbor gold could dull the truths he had uncovered tonight. He thought of the little things. His father's sneer, the scorn that had clung to every utterance Tywin directed at Tyrion, as if it were an insect crawling on his boot. He recalled the infamous line Tywin had spat at him once. "You are no son of mine." But if that were true, then Tyrion was free to act, was he not? A servant knocked gently at his door. Tyrion shoved the parchments under a stack of ledgers on the table. He coughed, drawing the thick folds of his cloak around him. "What is it?" "A letter for you, my lord," came a hesitant voice, Arrived by Raven not an hour ago. Tyrion motioned for the servant to enter. A lad no older than 14 tiptoed in, eyes wide, as though worried the imp might bite his head off. He placed a sealed scroll on the table and scurried out, allowing Tyrion to return to his solitude. Breaking the seal, Tyrion saw that the letter came from a quiet ally whose name he dared not even speak in this keep, for fear the walls had ears. Prince Oberyn Martell of Dorne. The letter was laconic, but it dripped with cunning. The Red Viper had learned, through his own network of informants, of new evidence regarding Tywin Lannister's involvement in the deaths of Elia of Dorne and her children all those years ago. Moreover, Oberyn wrote that if Tyrion was truly searching for ways to bring Tywin's misdeeds to light, Dorne would stand behind him. Implicitly, that meant a chance at forging a new alliance, though one still fraught with venom. Tyrion felt an odd stirring of hope. The Martells had always harbored a bitter hatred for House Lannister over the brutal fate that had befallen Elia. But even so, they had never possessed enough sway to challenge Tywin directly. There was always a bigger game in play, with the Iron Throne overshadowing it all. If Oberyn was willing to help, perhaps others were too. The question was what shape that help would take and who else might risk the Lion's wrath. Later that day, with the sun bright in the sky, Tyrion ventured out of his chambers. The halls of the Red Keep echoed with clanging steel and hushed footsteps. Even with a Lannister on the throne as Queen Regent Cersei, his dear sister, he felt no comfort. He was the master of coin for the realm, yes, but his father was the hand of the king. There was nowhere for Tyrion to act without Tywin's knowledge creeping over him like a chill draft. He descended a winding set of steps to a lesser-seen courtyard, where a certain pair of eyes might observe him in private. Shae was waiting under the shade of a twisted tree, lips painted as red as fresh blood, hair bound in jeweled pins, altogether too fine for a woman of her station. Tyrion had insisted on it, showering her with extravagant gifts. He was drawn to her, as always, though of late a sense of caution warred with his lust. In the game that was about to begin, Shae's life could be forfeit if Tyrion took a single misstep. The knowledge unsettled him, like a dull blade scraping against his spine. Shae's pout turned into a smile when she saw him approach. He tried to keep his face neutral, mindful of any watchful eyes from above. She let him lead her into a secluded alcove near an old stone bench. The courtyard was hidden from the main thoroughfares, though no place in the Red Keep was truly safe from prying ears. "What's wrong, my lion?" she asked in a teasing whisper. "You look as though you've swallowed a porcupine." He stared at her, torn between wanting to confide everything and the knowledge that sharing secrets could put her in greater danger. In the end, he offered, "Too many schemes at once. I suppose you can guess who is at the center of them." She arched an eyebrow. "Your father." He gave a short nod, stepping closer to press a quick kiss against her painted lips. "I need you to be careful," he murmured, pulling back to measure her expression. "If I call on you to leave King's Landing, you must not hesitate. Leave at once. Promise me." She glanced up, searching his face for meaning. Finally, she shrugged and tried to disguise the flicker of fear in her eyes with a careless laugh. "As you say, my lion." He left her there, after reminding her to keep to her rooms unless summoned, and made his way to the small council chamber. Tywin Lannister was already seated in his high-backed chair, looking every bit the austere patriarch he was, his mien uncompromising. Cersei lounged to the hand's left, while the chairs reserved for other council members stood empty for the moment. Jaime was off with the Kingsguard, no doubt training in the yard or skulking about the city. Tyrion stopped short of entering fully, unnerved by the intensity of his father's gaze. Tywin observed him silently, as if appraising whether Tyrion's presence carried the stink of mischief. Cersei, swirling a cup of wine, did not bother to mask her scorn. She smirked as though she alone were privy to some grand cosmic joke. "And where have you been?" Tywin's voice was crisp. "Here and there, Lord Father," Tyrion answered with a dramatic bow. "Tending to the kingdom's finances, of course. Some of us work." Tywin said nothing, his eyes as cold as iron. The tension in the room swelled. Cersei took a sip of wine, a smile dancing around the edges of her mouth. Tyrion half expected Tywin to bring up the matter of certain documents or letters, but the old lion remained silent. It was a small reminder that Tywin saw no need to justify or explain himself to Tyrion. The father's word was law, and any knowledge Tyrion gained, he must do so at his peril. When Pycelle shuffled in minutes later, all stooped posture and trembling hands, Tywin summoned him forward with an impatient flick of the wrist. Lord Tyrion, the master of coin, will be providing an update on the crown's debts, Tywin announced. But first, Maester Pycelle, what news of the storms in the Stepstones? The meeting continued in the usual dryness of state affairs. Tyrion wore a mask of politeness, chiming in when appropriate about the cost of provisioning troops near the coast. He felt the weight of the hidden parchments brand his memory, hot as wildfire. He glanced at his father's stony face. In Tywin's expression, Tyrion saw a reflection of that unstoppable ambition that had shaped the realm for decades. No flicker of guilt or regret. No sign that the man was even capable of remorse for the horrors committed in the name of House Lannister. When the meeting concluded, Tyrion allowed Pycelle and Cersei to leave first. He tarried by the door, fiddling with a quill as if lost in thought. Tywin, gathering a few scrolls, barely looked up. "Did you require something, Tyrion?" Tyrion looked at his father, measuring his words. "Only to say that times are changing, father. These small lords, the ones we might consider inconsequential, may not remain so forever." Tywin regarded him coolly. "I am well aware of that." Tyrion lingered a heartbeat longer. Then, with a small smile that did not touch his eyes, he left. Though Tywin might suspect that Tyrion schemed, he had no inkling, Tyrion hoped, of the precise nature of what was about to unfold. The next few days were a frantic dance of hushed conversations, covert exchanges, and carefully placed letters. Tyrion used his position as master of coin to search the crown's ledgers for certain irregular payments made during the war, disguised as shipping costs or bribes to foreign merchants. He had a knack for spotting financial trails that others might overlook. Piece by piece, he built a thorough ledger of evidence that connected Tywin's name to the war crimes in question. Oberyn Martell sent further missives, this time more direct. He wrote that the time for retribution was ripe. The Martells still longed to avenge Elia, and Oberyn was an uncoiled snake, poised to strike. Dorne's price for supporting Tyrion's revelations was simple. Tywin Lannister must fall, and the kingdom must acknowledge the Martells' rightful claim to justice. Tyrion was no stranger to devil's bargains, and while a part of him balked at trusting Oberyn's vow, he knew he needed allies. Varys appeared unannounced once more in Tyrion's chambers late at night, dressed in soft slippers that made no sound on the stone floor. Tyrion almost spilled his inkpot when the eunuch seemed to materialize behind him. "I trust you've been busy," Varys said in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "You might say that," Tyrion answered, swallowing his alarm. "Though I can never quite measure your role in all this, my friend. Are you aiding me, or merely stirring the pot for your own amusement?" Varys made a show of sighing. "My dear lord, you wound me. I serve the realm as I always have." "I do recall that is your familiar refrain," Tyrion muttered, though he could not entirely conceal his gratitude. "You told me to use this carefully, so I shall. But once released, these revelations cannot be silenced again. This will be more than a ripple in a pond, Varys. This will be a tidal wave." Varys dipped his head in agreement. "I am aware, but you should know something. Many watchers in King's Landing, from the High Lords to the common folk, already sense that House Lannister's hold on power is less than stable. Whispers abound that gold alone cannot buy devotion. If you strike, be sure it is a finishing blow. For if Tywin rises from the ashes, you will be his first target." Tyrion felt the chill of those words. It was a real possibility that if he failed, Tywin would subject him to a punishment so severe that the nightmarish rumors of what the old lion did to traitors would pale in comparison. "I do not plan on failing," Tyrion said at last. "But if you have any suggestions to improve my odds, I'm all ears." Varys's lips curved into a faint smile. "Established truths beyond denial. Accounts from nobles in the Crownlands, from peasants, from lords in the Westerlands who remain unbroken by fear. Dorne's testimony, if you can get it under seal, will also help. The more voices you gather, the less easy it will be to claim forgery or slander. And the impetus to act? Tyrion asked, heart-pounding. What will make King's Landing rise to this cause? The city might love scandal, but revealing it to the world is a different matter. The people have grown weary of secret dealings, Varys said. They crave a shape to their woes. If you deliver them the name of the author of so many sufferings, it may be enough to stoke righteous anger. Tyrion snorted softly. Righteous anger from a city that has endured everything from the Mad King's wildfire to Cersei's cruelty. But perhaps you're right. He allowed Varys to slip away into the darkness. Left alone with the scratch of his quill, Tyrion felt a deep sense of resolve. It was time to act. The first domino fell at a small council session, one that Tyrion had orchestrated under the guise of discussing the crown's debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos. Tywin Lannister presided at the head of the table. Cersei was there, as always, sipping her wine. Pycelle dozed, rousing himself when the conversation required. Lord Mace Tyrell was absent, away at Highgarden for an urgent matter. The only others present were some lesser members of the council, courtiers and scribes who recorded every utterance. Tyrion cleared his throat. My lords, it seems we have made some progress in analyzing the various debts the crown owes. However, in my duties I have come across, how shall I say, multiple suspicious payouts that occurred during and after the war. Many of them have no clear purpose. You will find them listed in these ledgers. He gestured for the scribes to distribute a limited number of pages he had prepared, each meticulously detailing sums drawn from the treasury. Tywin's gaze sharpened as the scribes approached. Cersei continued to sip her wine, looking bored, until she flipped through the pages. Her expression changed to one of baffled annoyance. What is the meaning of this? She asked. Tywin gave Tyrion a hard stare. I trust you have a point. Tyrion's heartbeat fluttered, but he made sure to speak calmly. My father always taught me that every coin spent should have a purpose, and every misused coin is a betrayal of the realm's resources. These particular transactions, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, were funneled into, how can I put it, deeds that defy the official records of the war. For instance, we see large payments that coincide with the destruction of small villages along the Gold Road, near the border of the Reach and the Westerlands, though no official campaign was recorded in that region at the time. And over here, we see suspicious sums paid to mercenary captains that are not affiliated with any known house. Strange, is it not? Cersei set her wine cup down hard. So, the war was chaotic. We needed Sel's words. That doesn't prove anything except the nature of war. Tyrion opened his hands in a gesture of innocence. Yes, indeed, war is chaotic. Yet, interestingly, these Sel's words reported directly to men who answered to the Warden of the West. My father, in other words. Tywin's glare could have boiled steel. And you accuse me of what, exactly? Tyrion forced a calm chuckle. Accuse? I merely present facts, which any man can interpret as he sees fit. He felt the tension roll through the room like a foul wind. Pycelle peered at the documents and cleared his throat. I see nothing but standard wartime expenditures. Perhaps inflated sums. But, Tyrion cut across him smoothly. That might be so. However, I would advise that we investigate thoroughly. It is only prudent in case any wrongdoing has occurred behind the scenes. I'm sure Father has no objection to a thorough investigation clearing his name. Now Cersei's face was a portrait of anger. You overstep yourself, imp. Tywin, though, remained controlled. If we must investigate, let it be done properly. You may assign a few accountants or scribes to look into this, but I will not see the realm's energy wasted on baseless insinuations. Is that understood? His tone brooked no argument. Tyrion nodded, as though bowing to authority. Of course, Father. I live but to serve. When the council adjourned, Tywin caught Tyrion's arm in a vice-like grip. The older man's mouth was set in a thin line. You think you're clever, don't you? You dare try to undermine me in a public forum. Keep your illusions of rebellion in check, Tyrion, or you will find that your place in this family can be revoked at any moment." Tyrion straightened his shoulders. "I merely do my duty. If you've nothing to hide, you needn't fear a thorough accounting." For a moment, he saw something flicker in Tywin's eyes, an edge of pure, murderous rage. Then his father released him. "Watch yourself," he snarled, turning on his heel to depart. Tyrion's breathing came quicker as he realized he had taken a step that could never be undone. But it was only the first of many. The next day, Tyrion scheduled a private audience, carefully orchestrated so that the court thought it was a trivial matter of finance. But in truth, the visitors were a delegation from Dorne. Oberyn Martell did not come personally. He was too wily to place himself in the lion's den without cause, but he sent 2 trusted envoys. They arrived draped in the colors of the rising sun's spear, their eyes shadowed and faces solemn. Once they were safely behind closed doors, Tyrion spoke softly. "What tidings from your prince?" The older of the 2 envoys stepped forward and offered a sealed document. "Prince Oberyn regrets that he cannot come in person, but he sends these affidavits, detailing Lord Tywin Lannister's role in the murder of Elia of Dorne and her children during the sack of King's Landing. They bear the seals of House Martell's most senior counselors and the testimonies of surviving men who served under the mountain that rides." Tyrion took the sheaf of parchment. He opened to read, his blood pounding at each line. The accounts were horrific. They included explicit references to orders given, passed down through the chain of command. Though the orders never bore Tywin's signature, the men swore under oath that they were threatened by Tywin's subordinates, that Tywin commanded ruthless efficiency, that the intention was to present the bodies of Elia and her children to prove House Targaryen's line was ended. By the time Tyrion finished, his hands were shaking. "This is powerful," he said in a low voice. "My father will deny it, of course. He'll say these are the lies of Dorne, conjured to foment unrest." The younger envoy, a woman with short-cropped black hair, lifted her chin. "Prince Oberyn knows that. But if your documents about the bribes and clandestine missions can show a pattern of duplicity and brutality, then our sworn statements may be more readily believed." Tyrion nodded. "We will have to handle this carefully. If the King's Guard or my father's men learn of your presence here, you'll be targets." The older envoy gave a humorless laugh. "House Martell is not afraid of Lannisters, but we appreciate your warning." Tyrion thanked them for coming, and they withdrew. As soon as the door shut behind them, he drew a ragged breath. The path he was on became clearer, more treacherous. There would be no turning back now. He needed more support, and that meant making overtures to other houses, perhaps the Riverlands, who had their own grudges against Tywin, or even those lords in the Westerlands who chafed at Tywin's iron grip. As the days passed, Tyrion sensed a tightening net of suspicion around him. Cersei glowered more openly whenever he entered a room. She started planting her own watchers to follow him around the castle. He noticed the same pair of gold cloaks appearing behind him in corridors, or standing idly outside his chambers. He suspected them of being in Tywin's or Cersei's employ. Yet Tyrion persevered, quietly meeting with a handful of minor lords who had old scores to settle. He spoke to the newly titled Lord Tarly, who was no friend to Lannisters and had recently lost men under suspicious circumstances in what was labeled a bandit raid near the border with the Westerlands. Tarly's men had discovered trampled fields, the smell of burned villages, and certain sigils half hidden in the rubble that pointed to Lannister men. Bit by bit, Tyrion collected stories, sworn statements, pieces of evidence that could not easily be refuted. He gathered them all carefully into a single chest, locked with 3 different keys. He alone held one key, Varys another, and Oberyn had the third, though Tyrion never told him precisely what it opened. Finally, after weeks of furtive planning, Tyrion resolved to release the storm. He stood on a balcony overlooking the city that night, the wind carrying the acrid scent of tanneries and the sea. King's Landing glittered with torches below, a cesspit of power and misery. He felt a pang in his chest at the idea that so many innocents here had also been victims of Tywin's machinations. Through forced starvation, brutal crackdowns, or quiet manipulations that had left them indebted. He had written letters addressed to several key figures across the realm. Lady Olenna Tyrell, who might see advantage in toppling Tywin. Prince Doran Martell of Dorne, who needed more reason to break King's Landing's hold. Lords in the Vale who were quietly disgruntled with Lannister meddling. He also penned a short but explosive letter to the Iron Bank of Bravos, insinuating that the Lannisters' gold might be less secure if the allegations about Tywin reached open hearing in front of the entire Seven Kingdoms. Tying finances to the moral outcry might bring more pressure than simple indignation. He gave these letters to trusted couriers, men and women handpicked by Bronn and disguised as common travelers. The letters were to go out at dawn. Once the ravens carried their messages, there would be no undoing it. Early next morning, Tyrion took a seat in his solar and waited. Sure enough, barely 2 hours past sunrise, there was a pounding at the door. He opened it to reveal his sister, flanked by 2 Lannister guards. Cersei's face was pale with fury. She pushed inside without invitation. "You dare!" she hissed, rounding on him. "Father says you have been gathering documents, forging claims of wrongdoing by House Lannister. Is this true?" Tyrion placed a hand on his chest as if offended. "Forging? I am offended at the suggestion." She slapped him hard across the face. The sting of it burned his cheek. The guards hovered uncertainly. Cersei's voice trembled with rage. "Father wants the documents you have been collecting. He wants them destroyed. Now, where are they?" Tyrion kept his face impassive. "Documents? Are you so certain they exist here, in my private chambers, for you to seize?" Another slap. This time Tyrion tasted blood on his lip. The guards stiffened. Cersei looked as though she might claw his eyes out. "Impertinent wretch," she seethed. "You think this is some game? You think you can hide behind your clever wit? Father will see you flayed if you continue down this path. Give me those parchments, or you'll regret it." He dabbed the blood from his lip with a corner of his sleeve. "Sister dear, you should calm yourself. I suspect your outraged screams may bring half the keep running. Is that what you want? A spectacle?" She glared at him, her nostrils flaring. "You think you can blackmail us? Expose our father's dealings? That's treason, Tyrion." "Treason requires betrayal of the crown," he said coolly. "Yet if the crown were to discover that the hand has committed atrocious acts in the kingdom's name, well, who, then, is the real traitor?" Cersei's hand lifted again, but this time he caught her wrist. His voice was low. "Be careful, Cersei. You're not dealing with a petulant child. If you truly believe I have threatened the stability of House Lannister, striking me here and now will not fix that. The truth is out. It's beyond these walls." A moment of bleak silence passed as his words sank in. He watched the flicker of panic in her eyes. She knew then that he might not be bluffing. Yet she let out a derisive laugh, a hollow sound. "You fool," she spat. "You'll bring the entire house to ruin." Tyrion let go of her wrist. "Only one man truly threatens House Lannister. He has for years." She stared at him, lips parted, 1,000 unsaid curses dancing behind her eyes. Then, whipping around, she stormed out. The guards followed, uncertain. The hours that followed were fraught with anticipation. Tyrion called Bronn to his side, instructing him to keep watch. "If Father sends men to arrest me, I need enough time to do what must be done." Bronn gave a lopsided grin. Well, let them try. They won't get you without tasting my steel first." By midday, the Red Keep was abuzz with rumors. No one knew the full story, but word spread that Tyrion Lannister had discovered damning information about the Lord Hand. Some believed it was an argument over coin. Others whispered of darker secrets. At supper, Tyrion did not appear in the Great Hall. He stayed in his chambers, reviewing the final copies of the evidence he would present publicly. Then the summons came not an hour before midnight. A pair of gold cloaks hammered at his door, commanding him to attend the throne room at once. Tyrion squared his shoulders, adjusted his doublet, and took a stiff drink of wine. Bronn looked worried, but Tyrion merely said, "Wait here. If I do not return in an hour, do as we planned." The trek to the throne room felt interminable. His footsteps echoed off the vaulted ceilings, the torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. When he arrived, a cadre of Lannister guards stood menacingly near the entrance. Inside, the throne room was illuminated by rows of torches, and Tywin Lannister sat on the Iron Throne. Cersei was at his side. Jaime lingered nearby in his Kingsguard whites, his expression pained. Pycelle trembled behind a small dais, and several other courtiers gathered in a hush. Tyrion stepped forward. "You summoned me, father." Tywin's countenance was set in grim lines. "Yes, the hour is late, but urgent matters require clarity. I have received disturbing reports that you are conspiring to defame House Lannister with outlandish accusations of war crimes." He spoke each syllable with biting force. "I will not tolerate such treason, not even from my own blood." Tyrion felt an odd calm settle over him. "Treason, is it? To reveal the truth." Cersei's voice slithered across the chamber. "Brother, dear, your cunning has ever been overshadowed by your arrogance. You think the realm will believe your lies." Tyrion locked his gaze on Tywin. "Father, you once said that the lion does not concern himself with the opinions of sheep. But you forget how large the flock can be, especially when angered." A muscle in Tywin's jaw twitched. "I have indulged your insolence for too long, imp. Hand over every scrap of paper, every letter, or so help me, I will destroy you." Tyrion dared a small smile. "Would that not simply confirm your guilt, father? And as for destroying me, well, the evidence is already beyond your reach. Copies have been sent across the 7 kingdoms. By now, Dorne has all it needs to press its claim for justice, and letters have been delivered to other lords eager to see you called to account for your atrocities. The gold you command will not buy back your reputation once this hits every corner of Westeros." A spark of pure fury ignited in Tywin's eyes. He stood from the throne, descending the steps with slow, deliberate steps until he stood over Tyrion. "You are no son of mine," he hissed, voice shaking in uncharacteristic anger. Tyrion lifted his chin, swallowing the ache that came with those words. "At last, something we can agree upon." Tywin raised a hand, as though to strike him, but stayed it when Jaime stepped forward. "Father," Jaime started, voice low. "Don't do this." Cersei whirled on Jaime. "You dare to defend this wretch? He has placed us all in peril." Jaime's eyes flickered between Tyrion and Tywin. "Let him speak. What precisely are these crimes you claim to have evidence of, Tyrion?" Tyrion faced his brother. Jaime was torn, Tyrion could see. The man had rarely challenged Tywin in the past, but he still had a shred of conscience left. "Father ordered the destruction of certain villages under the false pretense that they harbored rebels. He signed off on bribes to cover up the slaughter of innocents in the aftermath of the sack of King's Landing. He aided and abetted Gregor Clegane's monstrous acts. He used foreign mercenaries to strike at civilians loyal to Houses Tully and Stark, leaving no official record so that he might hide behind plausible deniability. The list is long, brother." Jaime's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at Tywin, who wore an expression of haughty disdain. "Is this true?" Jaime asked quietly. Cersei snapped, "Of course not. He's lying. Or at best, weaving half-truths from old rumors." Tyrion produced a small leather-bound ledger from his coat. "This is but a fraction of the evidence, father. Coin transfers you authorized as Master of Coin, well before I took the role. The ones labeled simply as emergency funds, but which correlate exactly to documented atrocities." He tossed it onto the marble floor between them. It landed with a resounding slap, the pages fanning out. The watchers let out a collective murmur. Tyrion scanned the crowd. Some faces were shocked. Others, like Pycelle, seemed full of dread. Tyrion knew that half of them likely had no appetite for the truth, but the seed was planted. Tywin regarded the ledger with cool contempt. "Forgeries," he declared. "You must have had these ledgers crafted to incriminate me. Is that how low you'll stoop?" Tyrion forced a laugh. "Father, Do you truly think I could bribe so many accountants, so many scribes, to produce these? If so, you overestimate my pockets and underestimate your own capacity for leaving a trail." Tywin turned to Jaime. "I see this is pointless. The imp has chosen his path. He means to blacken the name of House Lannister. Very well. Tyrion, in the name of the king, I place you under arrest for high treason." Jaime's face paled. "Father," he started, but Tywin cut him off with a glare. Tyrion stood tall as the gold cloaks moved in. He did not flinch. "Arrest me if you wish, father. The damage is done. You cannot unring a bell, nor can you hide from the truth. House Martell, the River Lords, even some in the Westerlands will not stand by once they learn of your crimes." There was a beat of silence as the gold cloaks seized Tyrion's arms. He looked into Tywin's face, a face carved of granite. There was no remorse, no doubt, only lethal coldness. "Take him," Tywin commanded, and so Tyrion was escorted roughly to the dungeons, the torchlight casting flickering shapes on the walls. Behind him, he heard Cersei's voice crowing in triumph, though there was an edge of hysteria to it, as if she grasped how precarious their position really was. Jaime said nothing. The black cells were as dank and foul-smelling as Tyrion remembered from the last time he was thrown in. They shoved him inside, slamming the iron door shut. Alone in the darkness, Tyrion's heart hammered. He had done it. He had turned on Tywin Lannister fully in front of witnesses. Soon, the realm would react, and only the gods knew how events might spiral. But he was not without contingency plans. Bronn, Podrick, and others loyal to him still roamed the keep. Varys was out there, lurking in his secret passages. The letters had already been sent. Tyrion allowed himself a small smile, even in the gloom. If Tywin thought locking Tyrion up would silence him, the old man would soon learn otherwise. Days passed in darkness. Occasionally, a jailer would bring stale bread and water. Tyrion used the time to replay every possible outcome in his mind. At times, panic seized him, as he feared his father might resort to a quiet execution. But he consoled himself with the knowledge that if Tyrion died suddenly, suspicion would point squarely at Tywin. The realm was watching now. The Lannister name was on precarious footing. He kept track of time by the number of meals. On the third day, the door to his cell was thrown open, torchlight stabbing his eyes. A figure loomed. "Jaime." "Brother?" Jaime murmured, dismissing the jailer with a curt nod. Tyrion could barely see Jaime's face. "You must know how dire this is," Jaime continued, stepping closer. "Father is livid. The entire court is in an uproar. You've sown chaos." Tyrion let out a rasping chuckle. "Then I succeeded." Jaime bent down, holding the torch aside. "Listen to me. There are lords demanding an investigation now. Whispers have reached the streets. The people are outraged. Someone scrawled curses against Tywin on the walls of Flea Bottom. The rumor is that Tywin had entire villages burned, that he conspired with Gregor Clegane to slaughter children. Dorne is calling for an open trial. They threaten to align with the Iron Bank to call in the crown's debts if Tywin is not brought to justice. Tyrion's pulse quickened. So the tide is turning. Jaime exhaled sharply. It's more than that. Father is losing control of the narrative. He can't simply deny everything because too many witnesses are coming forward. Some from the Westerlands, even men whose families died under suspicious circumstances. It's not just you, Tyrion. You've unleashed a flood. Tyrion felt a surge of vindication. And what do you plan to do about it, brother? Will you stand by Father's side? Or will you let this madness reach its rightful conclusion? Jaime ran a hand through his golden hair, eyes flickering. I don't know. I hate this. Father has done unspeakable things. I never wanted to believe it. He always said everything he did was for the good of House Lannister, to protect us, to protect the realm from rebellion. But if even half of the accusations are true, 7 hells. He trailed off. The torch crackled in the silence. Finally, he grimaced and placed something in Tyrion's hands. A small iron key. Tyrion looked at it, puzzled. Jaime's voice was strained. It unlocks the door to the upper corridor that leads to the stables. If you time it right, you can slip away at night. But you must hurry, or father will surely have you killed, trial or no trial. Tyrion's eyes widened. You want me to run? Jaime glanced away. I can't let them butcher you. Perhaps you can go to Pentos or the Free Cities. Father's hold might not reach you there. Tyrion felt an unexpected pang. You would sacrifice your own father's pride to save me? Jaime's brow furrowed. I don't know what's right anymore, but I won't let them kill you. That is all I know. For a moment, Tyrion's mind whirled. If he fled, it might look like an admission of guilt or a flight to avoid confrontation. Then again, if he stayed, Tywin might cut short the entire matter with Tyrion's head on a spike, as he had threatened. Jaime, if I run, the realm loses the face behind these accusations. Father will call me a coward and claim it was all slander. And if you stay, he might kill you. Jaime shot back, voice urgent. Think about Shay, Podrick, Bronn. He'll have them hunted down and tortured for any scraps of additional evidence. He's set on crushing this rebellion, no matter the cost. Tyrion licked his dry lips, a cold sweat on his brow. The evidence is out. People are speaking up. If my disappearance is seen as forced, or if something happens to me, it will only stoke the flames. I need a chance to address the realm openly, to see Tywin called to account in some form of justice. But that may be too much to hope for. Jaime sighed heavily. For now, I can't free you outright, or father will know I was complicit. But at least consider escaping. The key is yours. With that, Jaime turned to go. His shoulders slumped in defeat. At the door, he paused. I never wanted this, Tyrion. Nor I, brother, Tyrion replied softly, watching Jaime's back as he departed. In the days that followed, tension gripped King's Landing like a vice. News traveled fast, from the Crownlands to Dorne to the Riverlands. The High Septon, pressed by outraged faithful hearing rumors of atrocities, began calling for an inquest. The Iron Bank representatives arrived, refusing to release further funds until the matter was settled. A flurry of ravens soared between the castles of Westeros, carrying letters that demanded Tywin's accountability or voiced disbelief at the accusations. Within the Red Keep, Tywin tightened his grip, sending men to silence or coerce those who spoke too loudly. But it was too late to bury it all. The city seethed with intrigue, and on the tongues of every fishmonger and blacksmith was the same question. Is it true? Did the Lannisters commit such horrors? At last, a formal session was called in the throne room, presided over by the king. Though the king was too young to understand the depth of the matter, so Tywin effectively controlled proceedings. A panel of lords convened, some loyal to Tywin, others uncertain. The High Septon made an appearance, and so did representatives of Dorne, brazenly wearing their sun and spear sigils in silent protest. Tyrion was dragged before them in chains, flanked by gold cloaks. He saw the great pillars of the hall lined with spectators. The air hummed with tension. Tywin sat on a raised dais, while the king was perched on the Iron Throne like a confused child. Tyrion recognized the child's vacant stare. It was Tommen, too soft for this madness. The High Septon stood, clearing his throat. The faith cannot abide the rumors of these monstrous acts. We gather here that the accused may answer them. Tywin rose, a stern figure in crimson and gold. These allegations are an insult to the crown and to House Lannister. My vile son, Tyrion, stands accused of forgery, treason, and slander against the hand of the king. Let him speak his defense if he can. Tyrion's chains rattled as he lifted his hands to emphasize his helpless state. He surveyed the assembly, locking eyes with Oberyn Martell, who lounged against a pillar, arms crossed, face grim. Then he spoke, voice echoing in the hall. My lords and ladies, good people of King's Landing, I have indeed brought forth the allegations that the hand of the king orchestrated multiple atrocities during the recent war. Murders, rapes, burnings of villages and towns where none but the small folk lived. I do not ask you to take me at my word alone. I have brought witnesses, documents, and testimonies. They are not fabrications. They are the voices of the dead, crying out for justice. Tywin's lip curled. Where are these so-called witnesses? Produce them, or stand revealed as a liar. Tyrion gave a slight nod to the doors. On cue, Varys slipped in, leading a handful of people. Some peasants from the Riverlands, an old soldier from the Westerlands, and a trembling woman who had once been forced to watch her entire family murdered under a Lannister banner. Each had sworn depositions, but Tyrion wanted them to speak in person, to force the court to hear their plight. One by one, under the scrutiny of 100 watchful eyes, these witnesses told their stories. The old soldier explained how he was ordered by a Lannister bannerman to burn a village suspected of hiding Tully loyalists. He recounted how, afterward, Tywin had offered hush money to ensure no official record remained. The peasant woman spoke of seeing men in crimson cloaks drag her sister away, never to be seen again. A man from the Crownlands described the systematic seizure of farmland, with Tywin's seal approving the expropriation. The court grew restless. Some lords demanded proof of the authenticity of these claims. Others muttered that these were old grudges resurrected. But the atmosphere was shifting. More than a few onlookers stared at Tywin with open suspicion. The High Septon tapped his staff. "These are grave accusations indeed, Lord Tywin. How do you answer them?" Tywin stood, his countenance radiating confidence. "I call them base lies from traitors and turncloaks. We all know the war was a difficult time. Men wore false cloaks to sow confusion. My name has been used by unscrupulous captains to commit outrages. I will not be held accountable for the crimes of brigands." Oberyn Martell stepped forward at that moment, his voice a smooth drawl. "And what of the murder of my sister, Elia, and her children?" The crowd murmured, eyes flicking between them. "It is known that your man, Gregor Clegane, did the deed. He was your sworn sword." Tywin's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. "The Mountain acted without my direct orders. He was a savage brute." Oberyn barked a harsh laugh. "Convenient to blame the brute now that he's rotting. Yet we have men who testify he was following instructions from the highest seat." The tension thickened. Tyrion's heart hammered. This was the moment. If the realm's collective sense of outrage tipped over, Tywin's iron grip could crack. But Tywin had spent a lifetime building fear and alliances. Fear might yet prevail over truth. Suddenly, a voice from the crowd, "Let the dwarf speak!" Heads turned to see a group of commoners pressing forward, unstoppable despite attempts by guards to hold them back. One of them was a ragged man with a bandaged stump in place of a right hand. "He's the one who exposed this," the man said hoarsely. "Let him say his piece. Let him tell the realm what Tywin Lannister did." Tyrion's throat went dry, but he summoned his courage. Tywin Lannister is not merely a man who waged a hard war. He is a man who systematically sacrificed innocence for his ambition. He condoned war crimes. He paid for them, and he profited from them. Men, women, children killed and cast aside. Their homes burned. Survivors left to starve. All to feed his vanity and power. Tywin snapped. "This is madness, fabrications designed to break the alliance of the realm. My son is a dwarf, twisted in body and mind, resentful of House Lannister. Let none forget that." A hush fell. Tyrion felt fury course through him. "Indeed, I am a dwarf, father, but that does not make me a liar. You taught me much about cunning, about cruelty. It is time the realm learns what you are truly capable of, and what you would do to maintain your power." At that moment, chaos erupted. Some knights shouted for Tyrion to be silenced. Others demanded further proof. The peasants shouted curses at Tywin. Lords from the Westerlands exchanged fearful glances. In the midst of it, the king looked on with wide eyes, too young to comprehend the severity of the events unfolding. The High Septon banged his staff. "Order! Order!" But the crowd would not calm. Soldiers stepped forward to protect Tywin as some of the small folk surged, screaming about burned villages. Oberyn and Dorne's retinue squared off with Lannister guards. Cersei shouted at Jaime to maintain order. Jaime tried to keep the peace, but the tension grew thick and dangerous. And then, like a sudden shift in wind, a messenger burst through the throne room doors, panting. He approached the dais and shouted for all to hear, my Lord Tywin, Lady Olenna Tyrell has pledged the support of House Tyrell to an inquest on these charges. They refuse further shipments of grain to the capital until the matter is resolved." The crowd gasped. Starving the city was a powerful threat. Without the Reach's bounty, King's Landing would soon face shortages. Another messenger, pushing his way forward, added, "The Iron Bank has frozen all further loans until the charges are addressed, and they are calling for Lord Tywin to be suspended as hand until it is resolved." Tywin's face flashed with rage. "They cannot." But the crowd took this as confirmation that the realm's powers outside King's Landing were no longer allied to Tywin. Voices rose louder, calling for the removal of the hand. Some wanted him arrested. The Gold Cloaks tried to restore order, but the wave of protest continued to swell. Tyrion watched it all with a sense of awe and dread. This was exactly what he had wrought. The unmasking of Tywin Lannister's crimes, the fracturing of Lannister power, the unleashing of the kingdom's outrage. He was no longer sure if it could be controlled. Amid the chaos, Tywin roared for the guards to seize Tyrion and silence the witnesses. But the situation had spun beyond simple arrest orders. Oberyn's men drew their spears, defying the Lannister guards. Some watchers from the Vale shouted that they would not stand by while a man was silenced without due process. The throne room, once the seat of the realm's highest power, had become a battleground of words and loyalties. As the uproar reached a fever pitch, Tyrion felt a meaty hand clamp on his shoulder. He turned to see Bronn, who had somehow slipped in through the fray. Bronn grinned, though his eyes were sharp. "Time to go, my lord, before they rip you apart in the name of justice, or your father decides to quietly bury a dagger in your back." Tyrion nodded. He glanced around. Jaime stood a short distance away, struggling to separate men who had drawn steel. Cersei was nowhere to be seen, presumably whisked away by her personal guard. Varys, perched near a pillar, caught Tyrion's eye and gave the slightest nod, as if to say, "Go now." With Bronn's help, Tyrion slipped away from the dais. None of the Gold Cloaks dared risk stepping between the clashing factions to recapture him. They were too busy trying to quell the riot. Step by step, Tyrion retreated until he passed through the side door. Once in the corridor, he broke into a run, Bronn at his side. Neither spoke. Behind them, the throne room's noise reverberated, a chorus of shouts and steel. They descended a spiral staircase and emerged near the courtyard, where a number of horses were corralled. Tyrion saw Podrick waiting, holding the reins of a sure-footed mare, and Shae, pale-faced, clutching a small satchel. Tyrion vaulted awkwardly into the saddle, wincing at the pain in his chains. But he realized the shackles had been unlocked. Jaime's key, or perhaps Bronn's lockpick. They galloped out of the Red Keep as the city watch parted in confusion. Word had not yet spread that Tyrion was to be detained. Or perhaps the men simply didn't want to pick a fight with Bronn's well-armed companions. Riding through the city, Tyrion saw small folk gathered in knots, discussing the rumors in hushed or outraged tones. The name Tywin Lannister was on every tongue. Some spat on the ground at the mention. They were father and son, one in flight, the other enthroned in a palace of fury. Tyrion knew there was no going back. Exiting the gates near dusk, they disappeared into the countryside. That night they made camp in a small abandoned barn. The flickering firelight illuminated Shae's tear-streaked face, Pod's trembling hands, and Bronn's grim smirk. Tyrion knew that somewhere behind them, the entire shape of the realm was in flux. Yet in his heart he felt a strange relief. He had done it. He had exposed Tywin Lannister for the villain he was. House Lannister's credibility was collapsing like a castle built on sand. Soon, ravens would carry the official statements of the realm's lords condemning Tywin. The High Septon would likely demand a grand tribunal, or the Faith might call for trial by combat. House Tyrell's threat of withholding food would push the city to the brink if Tywin resisted. The Iron Bank's refusal to lend gold would send the crown into financial crisis. And Dorne would not rest until Tywin knelt, or until his blood stained the floor. Tyrion's only regret was that so many innocents might suffer in the chaos. Yet perhaps, in the rubble, a better order could emerge, one not built on the bones of the weak. In the far distance, lightning flickered across the sky, heralding a gathering storm. Tyrion stared into the shifting darkness beyond the barn door. He swirled a cup of wine in his hand, no arbor gold this time, but cheap local swill. As the thunder rumbled, he took a sip and let the bitterness settle on his tongue. He wondered if, after all of this, there was still a place for him in Westeros, or if this was merely the start of a long exile. He wondered how Tywin might retaliate, whether Cersei's cunning might yet buy the Lannisters a second lease on power. But he also thought of the men and women whose suffering had finally been brought to light, who might take some small measure of solace in seeing Tywin undone. "This is just the beginning," he said softly, to no one in particular. Bronn, polishing his sword by the fire, only grunted. Shay looked over in concern but said nothing. Podrick pressed closer to the flames. Dawn rose pale and uncertain. Tyrion pulled himself into the saddle, leading his small band away from the city that had shaped his destiny, uncertain if he would ever return. But he knew, without question, that House Lannister would never again be what it was. Tywin's iron fist had finally been pried open, the secrets spilled like red wine upon a pristine tablecloth, staining everything. The name Lannister would be forever marked by the revelations of war crimes, and the gold of Casterly Rock might not be enough to staunch the bleeding of lost prestige and alliances. Somewhere on the wind, Tyrion thought he heard the distant echo of a lion's roar. Angry, pained, dethroned. He whispered his farewell under his breath. "Vala Morgulis," he murmured, and as the horses trotted on, he allowed the final severing of the bond between father and son. Tywin Lannister had built his empire on fear, and in a single night of revelations, it had come undone like so many illusions. So rode Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf who exposed the lion, into a realm on the brink of change, leaving behind the ashes of old power and carrying with him a spark of a new, uncertain future. One where, for better or worse, Tywin Lannister was no longer untouchable. Tyrion woke to the uncertain gray of a new morning. The sky spread wide and empty above the ruins of a dilapidated barn, where he and his companions had taken shelter. The night had brought little rest. His dreams had been haunted by the furious noise of the throne room, by the sight of his father descending the dais in righteous anger, by commoners screaming for justice against Tywin Lannister. Even awake, Tyrion still tasted the bitterness of those memories. Like a dreg of cheap wine he could not spit out. Shay, curled near the embers of their small fire, shifted in her sleep. Podrick, looking even more boyish in the worn cloak Bronn had scrounged for him, had risen earlier to check on the horses. Tyrion pushed himself to sit upright, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness settling in his spine. The chain manacles had bruised his wrists before Jaime gave him that key. Now the broken links still chafed him, the memory of captivity a cold presence. He laid a hand on the scars that would remain. It had all happened so quickly, yet Tyrion knew in his heart it had been a long time coming. Years upon years of Tywin's tyranny, hidden behind the veneer of Lannister gold, had finally been dragged into the light. Under different circumstances, Tyrion might have felt triumph. He had done what so many had wished for but never dared attempt. He had bared Tywin Lannister's sins for the realm to see. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. He had lost his position, perhaps his chance at a normal life, and placed a price on his own head. More troubling still were the ramifications for House Lannister itself. Jaime remained behind, torn between duty and conscience. Cersei, consumed by wrath, would tighten her grip on power if she could. And Tyrion could not imagine the old lion meekly submitting to the calls for an inquest. 1,000 times in his life, Tyrion had seen how formidable Tywin could be when cornered. Tyrion got to his feet and limped toward the barn door. Outside, the crisp morning air smelled of damp straw and lingering smoke from distant cook fires. Beyond a sparse line of trees, the land sloped gently toward a broken fence. From the vantage of a small knoll, he glimpsed a dusty road leading away. What direction to take now? East to Rosby? North toward the Blackwater Rush? Or perhaps further south, seeking the road to Dorne? Each path carried its own perils. As of yet, they had no real plan, only escape. He heard Podrick's footsteps before the lad spoke. "Sir or my lord," Pod corrected himself. "The horses are fed. Bronn's gathering water from a stream behind the barn. He said we should leave soon." Tyrion brushed straw off his tunic. "We should, yes. The city watch might already be searching. Or worse, Father might send men under another banner." He had no illusions. Tywin would prefer to kill Tyrion quietly, well away from the prying eyes of the realm. A convenient bandit attack on the roads could dispose of the problem without further stoking the city's fury. Pod swallowed nervously, then glanced down. "My lord, are we deserters, then? Or traitors to the crown?" "No, Pod." Tyrion tried to sound reassuring, though the truth was more complex. "We're not traitors. Treason is a convenient label to silence truth. I've merely done what was necessary, and now we must live with the consequences." Shay emerged, rubbing the last vestiges of sleep from her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy braid, her usual flirtatiousness tempered by fear. She shot Tyrion a worried look. "Where to? We can't hide out in barns forever, my lion." Tyrion met her gaze and sighed. "We'll decide once we've put some distance behind us." He paused, taking a breath. "I'll tell Bronn we move within the hour. We've enough coin left for a few nights' lodging if we find some safe inn." Shay looked unconvinced. "And how safe do you think we'll be? The moment they see a dwarf with a sellsword and a boy, tongues will wag. The Lannisters have spies everywhere." "Indeed," Tyrion conceded. "We may need to travel under false names. Perhaps we can claim I'm a traveling performer. I do love a good stage drama, after all." Pod flushed, uncertain whether Tyrion was joking. Shay seemed torn between exasperation and genuine amusement. "At least you haven't lost your gallows humor, my lion." Tyrion gave a crooked shrug. "It's what remains when all else is stripped away." They packed quickly, gathering supplies. Bronn came striding in last, wiping water droplets from his hair, a half-smirk plastered across his face. "We follow the road south or west? Depends on how much you want to risk running into your father's bannermen." "South for now," Tyrion decided after a moment's thought. "Toward Storm's End, or at least that general direction, and from there we can weigh our options. Father's men will expect me to flee in some cunning direction, but perhaps the cunning move is to choose the obvious route and blend in." He let out a tight laugh. "We'll see how that works." Bronn shrugged. "Suits me. I've never been too picky about which road I take, so long as the job's good. And these days there's plenty of chaos about." They mounted and were away. The horses' hooves stirred up a thin cloud of dust along the rutted path. Tyrion tried to ignore the pang in his ribs from sleeping on the barn's hard floor, focusing on the horizon that beckoned. That day, they covered many miles, avoiding major thoroughfares where the gold cloaks might patrol. Podrick rode behind Shay, holding the reins for both of them. Tyrion guided his mare carefully, his short legs straining with every bump. Now and again, Bronn scouted ahead, returning with news of travelers or potential threats. Every so often, they passed peasants along the roadside. Tinkerers, ragged families with all their belongings piled on donkey carts, hedge knights who gave them only a cursory glance. Tyrion heard snatches of gossip. "The lion's done for," a woman told her husband. "They say Tywin Lannisters know better than the mountain. But my cousin said they locked up the dwarf, that it was all lies. House Tyrell's refusing to send any grain to the capital now. The city'll be starvin'. You mark my words." Tyrion felt those words like an ache in his bones. He had envisioned revealing Tywin's crimes, not depriving the entire city of bread. But House Tyrell was the breadbasket of the realm. If they withheld their harvest, King's Landing would be in dire straits by winter. That was precisely the kind of leverage the Reach might use to break Tywin. And once the rumor mills started, not even 1,000 swords could hush them. That evening, they made camp beneath an old oak. As Bronn and Podrick set about lighting a small fire, Shae settled beside Tyrion, leaning her head on his shoulder. The warmth of her body comforted him, though his mind churned with unties. He recalled the startled look on Jaime's face in the throne room, the pained disbelief that Tywin could truly be guilty of so many horrors. Deep down, Tyrion hoped Jaime might realize this was bigger than a father's reputation. Innocent blood stained their house, and that blood had called out for vengeance for far too long. Shae spoke quietly. "Do you think, maybe, if the realm believes you, your father will lose his title as Hand?" Tyrion exhaled. "He'll lose more than his title if Dorne and the Tyrells press the matter. They want Tywin on trial. The High Septon might demand a public reckoning, and if father refuses, well, the faith can stir the small folk to riot." Tyrion picked up a twig and snapped it between his fingers. "But don't mistake father for a cornered rat. He's still Tywin Lannister, and many fear him. He'll twist arms, bribe, threaten. If he can't salvage his name, he'll salvage his power." Shae's eyes fluttered closed, and she nodded. "I only hope it's enough that the truth is out. Those he hurt deserve that much." Tyrion studied her face. There had been a time he worried she would not understand the gravity of what he'd done. She'd always said she cared little for politics, that she only wanted to be near him, to enjoy the good life. But perhaps even Shae, cast out of King's Landing and forced to flee, recognized that some things were bigger than comfort. "We shall see," Tyrion said, letting his voice drift off. Sleep came fitfully once more. Tyrion's dreams teemed with images. Tywin's stony face looming above him, the Red Keep's halls echoing with screams, a swirl of surging peasants and gold cloaks. He dreamt of Oberyn Martell brandishing a spear, chanting for blood. He saw the rubble of burned villages, smelled the stench of charred flesh. He saw a flicker of the Targaryen sigil, as if Rhaegar's ghost or Elaya's weeping shade demanded retribution. The dream cracked open in a roar of flame, and Tyrion bolted upright, heart pounding, though no real fire burned near him. He found dawn creeping over the horizon again. One day at a time, he told himself. One day at a time. The next 10 days passed in a blur of travel. They kept off major roads whenever possible, cutting through farmland and once risking a swampy patch that left them covered in mud. Food was meager. They supplemented what they carried with occasional foraging and the luck of a kind old farmer who offered a half-dozen eggs in exchange for a silver stag. The farmer mentioned that rumors had reached even his out-of-the-way hovel. "Lord Tywin is to be tried as a butcher," the old man said, uncertain. "But I don't believe a word of it. The Lannisters are always strong." "What do I know?" Tyrion said nothing, merely thanked him for the eggs. Arguing would do no good. The realm would decide soon enough who or what Tywin Lannister truly was. When at last they reached a crossroad, Tyrion paused to consider. A rickety sign pointed east toward Hayford, west toward Rosby, and south toward the Wendwater region. The southern path would eventually link up with a major route heading to Storm's End. The question was, should they avoid any place with a strong Lannister presence, or risk traveling more swiftly by recognized roads? Bronn leaned in his saddle and spat. "If we keep going south, we'll run into roads patrolled by men loyal to the crown. That's your father's domain in practice, if not in name." Tyrion glanced up at the darkening sky. A swirl of thick clouds hinted at a gathering storm. "Then we must be cautious. We can't spend all our days skulking like criminals. If we push southward, we might find sanctuary with certain stormlords who owe no love to Tywin. Or we might find the gallows. It's a gamble." Shae spoke up. "I'd gamble on not freezing or starving. I don't fancy more nights in muddy fields." She tried to smile, but fatigue was etched in her features. Podrick shifted. "What if we tried to sail from one of the port towns, my lord? You said once we might take a ship to Pentos or Bravos. If Lord Tywin is truly in trouble, he might not be able to reach so far so soon." Tyrion mulled it over. "It's not a poor idea, but the gold cloaks may be on watch at each port, scanning for dwarfs. Subtlety would be paramount." Bronn shrugged. "I can secure a ship if you've got enough coin." Sailors don't ask questions if you pay them well. We could set sail at dusk, slip away. Tyrion wasn't sure how he felt about leaving Westeros entirely. The notion had crossed his mind. Jaime's whispered suggestion that he flee. The realm was in turmoil, a swirl of accusations that might spark open conflict. Part of Tyrion longed to see Tywin properly held to account. But what use was Tyrion if he remained a fugitive on the run? Wasn't his presence needed to press the truth? Or would he only paint a larger target on himself? He sighed. We'll think on it. For now, let's press south for another day or two. Then we'll decide if we cut east to try for a port. They rode on, the weather turning foul that afternoon. Rain lashed the countryside in freezing sheets. By nightfall, they stumbled upon an abandoned roadside shrine. The statue within had crumbled. Perhaps it was once a carving of the maiden or the smith, but time and war had left it shapeless. Yet there was enough roof left to provide some shelter from the downpour. They tethered the horses behind the shrine and huddled inside. Bronn built a small fire from damp twigs, cursing the entire time. Even with the roof overhead, water dripped through cracks in the rotted timbers, landing on Tyrion's head as he tried to doze. He found himself listening to the sighing wind, imagining it carried the voices of the thousands undone by House Lannister's brutality. Perhaps he was turning into a half-mad prophet of doom, conjuring ghosts. Or perhaps he was simply living with the knowledge that he had unleashed a juggernaut of consequences upon the Seven Kingdoms. By morning, the rains had subsided to a light drizzle. They resumed their trek, cloaks pulled tight, horses plodding through puddles. Midway through the day, an unexpected sound broke the monotony. The thunder of hooves approaching from behind. Instinctively, Tyrion raised a hand for the group to stop. Bronn's face hardened. He gripped the hilt of his sword. Podrick guided the horses off the path to a copse of trees, attempting to hide behind the foliage. Within moments, a band of riders came into view. They wore no house sigil that Tyrion recognized. Mud and grime smeared their cloaks. A few had battered armor, and one carried a spear with a ragged pennant that might once have been some minor lord's banner. They halted upon spotting Tyrion and company, eyes narrowing as if sizing them up. Bronn was already inching toward the scabbard at his hip. "Gods be good," Tyrion muttered under his breath. Out loud, he raised his voice in a forced greeting. "Well met, travelers." A tall man with a scraggly beard and hawk-like features urged his mount forward. "You're a dwarf," he stated, as if it were a revelation. "And that's a Sel's word at your side, by the look of it." Bronn gave a feral grin. "Observant bastard, aren't you?" The bearded man's eyes flicked over Shay and Podrick, then back to Tyrion. "We're hunting for outlaws. Got coin on their heads. Some dwarfs, they say, are quite a sight. Known to be cunning." Tyrion forced a laugh. "And I am known to be a mere jester, or so I'm told. Have you heard of me? I perform for local lords who appreciate good wit. My name is Yorick," he improvised. "Yorick the Clever. We're on our way to a wedding performance in the Stormlands." The man smirked, showing yellowed teeth. "A wedding, eh? I've heard rumors that King's Landing is in chaos. Folks fleeing every which way. How is it you're traveling toward the Stormlands for a wedding when lords are all holed up behind their walls?" Tyrion shrugged extravagantly, doing his best to invoke the flamboyance of a traveling performer. "The High Lords have their intrigues, good sir. We jugglers and fools must earn our keep, come war or peace. If I don't appear, I forfeit a handsome sum." He offered his most ingratiating smile. The man's expression hardened. "You speak like a lord, not a jester. I've met my share of minstrels and fools, and they're usually more boisterous." Tyrion tilted his head. "Perhaps you find me lacking in that regard? I'm no singer, but I can recite bawdy tales if you like. For a small coin, I'll even attempt a jig." Bronn coughed to smother a laugh. Podrick shifted uneasily, and Shay stared at the men, wariness plain in her eyes. The riders, 6 in total, whispered among themselves. One spat onto the muddy ground. Finally, the bearded man nodded. "We've no quarrel with jesters. But a dwarf is no common sight, especially these days. If you're lying to me, it'll cost you." He gestured to one of his companions, who reached into a saddlebag and retrieved something. A scrap of parchment. "We hear there's a price on the head of Tyrion Lannister, who's said to be short of stature and big of mouth. The bounty's not official, but plenty would pay well to deliver him to certain parties." Tyrion kept his features neutral, heart pounding. "Tyrion Lannister, you say? A dangerous fellow, no doubt. I've only heard rumors." The man watched him closely, then stuffed the parchment back. "We'll not waste more time on you. If you come across the imp, or any sign of him, you'd do well to let us know." He nodded toward the second man, who tossed Tyrion a battered tin badge. It bore a scratched lion, though hardly recognizable. "You send a raven to the inn at the crossroads, ask for Merrick. That's us." With that, the men urged their horses on. As they passed, Tyrion spotted a hunger in their eyes, the kind that sees only gold. He recognized it from countless dealings with sellswords and bounty hunters, the cold calculation that a man's body might be worth more than a harvest's bounty. He maintained his forced smile until they vanished down the path. Once the riders were gone, Tyrion exhaled and sank against his saddle. Shay let out a shaky breath. Bronn growled, "Next time, I might just kill them and be done with it." But Tyrion shook his head. "Too risky," Tyrion said. "We can't leave corpses on the roadside. That would draw even more attention. We need to lay low, not stoke further hunts." Podrick looked at the battered badge. "They'll keep searching, won't they?" "Yes," Tyrion replied. "They will, and so will many others, especially if Father's offering coin behind the scenes. He'll want me brought back in chains or dead, so he can retake control of the narrative." Shay asked, "Do you think they recognized you?" "They suspected, but without certain proof they'll go on sniffing about. We have to assume the road is full of watchers." Reluctantly, they pushed on, but Tyrion's mind spun. Tywin was clearly moving faster than Tyrion had hoped. Perhaps the old lion was outbidding Varys' caution, ensuring that unscrupulous men scattered across the crownlands were on the lookout. Tywin might have lost face in the courts, but gold could still buy him many loyal blades among the common rabble. At nightfall, they found a half-ruined watchtower set beside an overgrown orchard. Even from a distance, Tyrion could smell the rotted fruit. They cleared a small area within the tumble of stones. Bronn took first watch, while Tyrion huddled with Shay, pod curled nearby. Through the gaps in the collapsed roof, Tyrion could see a patch of stars. He tried to let their cold light calm him. Instead, he relived the moment his father rose from the Iron Throne, condemning him as a traitor. The memory tasted like poison. Sleep, when it came, was restless. He woke before dawn to find Bronn pacing outside, sword drawn. Something rustled in the orchard. Tyrion's heart leapt as he feared bandits or bounty hunters. But Bronn returned after a few moments, shaking his head in annoyance. Wild dogs, rummaging among the rotten fruit. Nothing more. Still, none of them found rest again. They took to the road at first light, hoping to put more miles behind them. By midday, they reached a scattering of hamlets, little more than clusters of huts. Tyrion wondered how many of these peasants might whisper the name Lannister like an evil omen. Word of war crimes, rapes, and razed villages would spread a special kind of bitterness toward the once mighty house. Or perhaps they would shrug and accept it as one more proof that lords were all monstrous. Common folk had learned cynicism in the long years of conflict. Some might even believe that Tywin's sins didn't matter so long as their own bellies were fed. Yet with the Tyrells withholding grain, that complacency might soon turn to anger. They avoided the hamlets, but at a small creek where women were scrubbing clothes, Shay offered to glean a bit of gossip. She went down alone, while Tyrion, Bronn, and Pod waited out of sight. She returned with news. The city was apparently in an uproar, or so the washerwomen said. Rumor had it that the High Septon threatened to call for Tywin's removal if he would not submit to an inquest by the Faith. Meanwhile, the small council was in disarray. Cersei remained in the Red Keep, watching her father's efforts to restore control. Some said Jaime Lannister had tried to speak on Tyrion's behalf but was silenced, his loyalty in question. A few even claimed Tywin considered disowning Jaime as well, though Tyrion doubted that. "He's turning on everyone," Shae concluded breathlessly. "Your father's no fool. He knows he needs scapegoats. Some blame is being shoved onto lesser bannermen. But the Martells in Dorne aren't satisfied. They want Tywin's head. They're writing open letters to the Lords of Westeros, demanding trial and restitution for Elia Martell's murder." Tyrion felt an odd pang of satisfaction. Even if Tywin recaptured Tyrion, the old man would face the fury of Dorne, House Tyrell's strategic strangling of the capital's food, and the Iron Bank's refusal to lend gold. The pillars that held up the Lannister name were shattering. But what would become of Westeros in the meantime? For a while, they rode in silence, passing fields drowned by the rain. The hush between them was not uncomfortable, but laden with thoughts unspoken. Eventually, Pod ventured a question. "My lord, do you think King Tommen can fix any of this?" Tyrion considered. Tommen was still a child, gentle and pliable. "He's a good boy," Tyrion said. "But a boy cannot stand against Tywin's will, nor Cersei's. The kingdom needs a strong hand to steer it in the midst of crisis. That's precisely the problem. The man who claims that hand is Tywin." Pod nodded, his expression somber. Shae guided her horse closer to Tyrion's. "Then maybe the High Septon will wrest control from Tywin. The faith has more influence over the people than the crown realizes sometimes." "True," Tyrion said, "but the faith militant has been disbanded for generations, though there are always rumors of it being revived. If that happens, if the faith or the small folk take up arms for justice, the realm could shatter into chaos. Another civil war if we're unlucky." Shae paled. "Then the war never ends?" Tyrion's jaw tightened. "That's the tragedy, isn't it?" As twilight fell, they arrived at a low ridge overlooking a shallow valley. From their vantage, Tyrion spotted a faint glow of fires, perhaps an encampment or a village. Bronn frowned. "Might be a few huts or maybe outlaws. Hard to say. We can circle around." They debated. Riding onward in darkness courted danger if they ran afoul of a band of cutthroats. But spending another night exposed in the open did not appeal, especially if bounty hunters roamed the roads. At length, Tyrion made the call. "We'll approach carefully. If it's a decent village, we can perhaps buy lodging in a barn or stable. I'm soaked through, and my backside aches something fierce." So they descended the ridge, picking their way through brush. The glow brightened until they could see it clearly. Several huts and a rough palisade near a bend in a modest river. Torches dotted the perimeter, though not in any organized guard pattern. It looked like a village that tried to maintain some defense in the face of bandits. At the gates, a pair of armed peasants barked a challenge. Bronn handled it, adopting the gruff, easy confidence that told them all they needed to know. They were travelers, seeking shelter, willing to pay. The villagers relented, letting them enter. Inside the palisade, the place was hardly more than a few dozen huts clustered around a muddy courtyard. An older man with a wispy beard, calling himself Hoster, welcomed them with the vague courtesy of one who needed coin. For a couple of silver stags, he offered up a corner of a stable that was half-burnt. Remnants of the war, no doubt. Once they settled in, Tyrion tried to glean local news. Hoster explained that men had come through days before, talking about a bounty on a dwarf. They claimed he was a murderer, said there'd be gold if we caught him. But we have enough troubles already. Hoster shrugged. Don't need more bloodshed, and dwarfs are scarce. Tyrion gave a small, tight smile. Yes, dwarfs are scarce indeed. Hoster eyed him up and down, but seemed too weary or apathetic to pry further. He warned them that they should keep within the village at night, as bandits prowled. Then he shuffled off. Tyrion and his companions huddled in their stable corner. The smell of old hay and damp would thick in the air. Somewhere outside, a baby cried. The walls were riddled with holes that let in the wind, and Tyrion doubted they'd find much warmth. Yet a thin soup was provided, a mixture of roots, onions, and a bit of salted pork. They ate in relative silence. Just before they tried for sleep, Tyrion heard new voices at the gate. He tensed. Bronn placed a hand on his sword. They heard the murmur of conversation, the squeak of hinges. Footsteps scuffed across the courtyard. Torchlight flickered through the stable's cracks. Tyrion mouthed to Bronn, "Check." Bronn nodded, leaving quietly to peer out. He returned moments later, looking grim. A handful of armed riders. Could be anything. They're not wearing any lord's colors, but they look too well equipped for bandits. I'd wager they're paid men. I caught only a glimpse from a distance. Tyrion's mind raced. We should hide or get out. Pod's eyes went wide. If we run, they'll see us. Shay nodded in agreement. We need a ruse, or we wait and see if they leave. But as the footsteps drew closer to the stable, Tyrion realized waiting quietly was no longer an option. The stable door creaked open. Torchlight flooded in, revealing a group of 4 men, with a 5th behind them. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a half-helm that concealed most of his face. The man in front raised the torch, its orange glow dancing over Tyrion's features. A heartbeat of silence followed. Then the big man stepped forward, voice muffled behind the helm. "Evening, travelers. We've had word a dwarf might be passing through these parts. Perhaps you've heard the rumor of a bounty." Bronn moved subtly, placing himself between them and Tyrion. "We're no bounty hunters," he growled. "We're just paying guests, so piss off." The helmed man let out a chuckle hollow as a grave. "Or perhaps you're the ones we're looking for." He signaled his men. Swords were drawn with a chilling hiss of steel. Tyrion's heart thundered. The stable offered little space to maneuver, and they were cornered. He saw the flicker of deadly intent in the stranger's eyes. These men were not amateurs, and yet, if they truly recognized him, they wouldn't bother with a polite greeting. They'd simply attack. So maybe they weren't certain yet. That was a narrow advantage. Bronn, always quick, snatched a pitchfork leaning against the wall, brandishing it. Pod stumbled backward, eyes darting for an escape route. Shay pressed close to Tyrion, terror in her face. Tyrion raised his hands placatingly. "Let's be calm, friends. No one needs to bleed tonight. We have no quarrel with you." The man with the torch sneered. "You can pay for safe passage if that's how you prefer it. Or you can answer our questions about the dwarf who's wanted." Tyrion tried to keep his voice steady. "What if we have no answers? How do we know you'll let us be on our way?" One of the other men spat on the ground. "We're done talking. Show us your face, dwarf." Tyrion clenched his teeth. Slowly, he stepped forward, letting the torchlight illuminate him fully. "There. Satisfied?" The helmed man studied him. A flicker of recognition might have crossed his eyes, but the dancing shadows made it hard to discern. "You do look like the Lannister imp," he muttered. "But we can't be sure." Bronn's pitchfork twitched dangerously. "I suggest you back off. This stable is small, and your numbers won't help if half of you get skewered before you can even swing a blade." "Bold words," one of the strangers snapped. He lunged suddenly, sword aimed for Bronn's midsection. Bronn pivoted, knocking the blow aside with the pitchfork's prongs. The clang of steel rang through the stable. Pod cried out. Shay stumbled backward, nearly falling into the hay. Tyrion's instincts screamed for him to get out of the line of fire. Chaos erupted, the stable filled with the swirl of men grappling, curses echoing. Bronn was a whirlwind, surprisingly nimble despite the cramped space, using the pitchfork to keep two swords at bay. One of the attackers tried to flank him, only for Bronn to pivot and drive the pitchfork's tines into the man's thigh. The fellow howled, dropping his torch, which sputtered in a puddle of stale urine near the animal's trough. Tyrion heard Shay scream as another man seized her arm, possibly hoping to use her as leverage. Podrick, panicked but loyal, grabbed a wooden club from the floor and swung wildly. He connected with the man's shoulder, forcing him to release Shay, who stumbled free. Tyrion, seizing what little advantage he had, drew a small dagger from beneath his cloak. He slashed at the attacker's arm, opening a shallow cut. The man yelped and reeled back. The helmed leader advanced on Bronn, sword raised. His movement was more disciplined than the others. The blade came down in a deadly arc Bronn barely managed to block with the pitchfork's wooden shaft, which cracked under the force. The pitchfork splintered, leaving Bronn holding half a pole with snapped prongs. Without hesitation, the attacker lunged again, forcing Bronn to retreat. But Bronn was cunning. He lurched sideways at the last moment, hooking a foot around an old bucket that lay on the stable floor. He kicked it at the man's ankles, tangling his steps. The big man stumbled, giving Bronn just enough time to dart in close. A dagger flashed in Bronn's free hand, slicing beneath the half-helm's edge. Blood sprayed across the stable wall. The man collapsed, gargling. His comrades faltered at the sight of their leader crumpling. Two of them, already wounded, staggered for the door, swearing they'd be back. Another lay motionless on the ground. The only one still upright was the man Tyrion had cut. He hurled curses, gripping his wounded arm, but with the leader down, his nerve broke. He fled, half sobbing, out into the night. Silence rushed in as the survivors vanished. Bronn stood panting over the body of the slain leader. The stable reeked of blood, sweat, and the acrid tang of spilled torch fuel. Tyrion's breath came in quick gasps. He glanced at Shae, who was shaking, trying to steady herself against a post. Podrick stared at the corpse, eyes wide with horror. "We need to leave," Bronn growled, wiping his dagger on the dead man's cloak. "Now." Tyrion nodded. "Yes. The villagers won't protect us after this. They'll either blame us for the bloodshed or demand more coin than we can afford." He approached Shae carefully, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "And no, I thought." Her voice cracked, and she threw her arms around Tyrion, trembling. Bronn retrieved what gear they could carry. Podrick helped Shae to her feet. Tyrion lingered only a moment, eyeing the dead man's half-helm. It was plain steel, unmarked by any sigil. "Could be mercenaries," he muttered. "Hired muscle from the Crownlands. They might have a direct line to Father's coffers." Bronn spat on the ground. "Let's not wait for them to come back with reinforcements." Outside, the village was in uproar. People emerged from huts, torches flaring. A few brandished farming tools, uncertain whom to blame for the violence. Tyrion tried to calm them, but the commotion swelled too quickly. A rock whizzed past Bronn's head. Another villager shouted curses, demanding they pay for the death in the stable. Hoster, the old man who had sold them lodging, stood in the doorway of his hut, gray hair awry, shouting that bloodshed was not permitted inside the palisade. "Time to run," Bronn barked, vaulting into the saddle. Pod and Shae mounted hastily. Tyrion wrestled himself up onto his mare, ignoring the pounding of his heart. Through the dim glow of scattered torches, they galloped for the gate, which was still partially ajar. A village man tried to bar their path, clutching a spear that shook in his hands. Bronn shouted for him to stand aside, and the man leapt away rather than be trampled. They thundered through the gate, onto the open road again. The night swallowed them, cold and merciless. No one gave chase at first, but Tyrion suspected that more pursuers might come once the villagers gathered their wits. The body in the stable would only confirm that something was amiss. They pressed hard for over an hour, following a winding path by moonlight. At last, they slowed to a canter. Tyrion's lungs burned with exertion. The adrenaline of the fight still coursed through him. Shae was silent, her face drawn. Pod clung to his saddle, eyes darting every which way. Even Bronn seemed uneasy, scanning the darkness. When they finally stopped near a shallow ravine to let the horses drink, no one spoke for a time. The only sound was the rush of water and the ragged breathing of their mounts. At length, Bronn broke the silence. "Well, that's that. We can't rely on rickety palisades and half-rotten stables for safety. If men are searching for a dwarf with a bounty on his head, every backwater village will be a risk." Tyrion slid off his horse, nearly collapsing as his knees threatened to buckle. He steadied himself against a tree. "Agreed," he managed. "The question is, Do we head for the coast to find a ship, or try to make it to someplace less hostile, like Tarth or even Dorne? The Dornish want Tywin's blood. They might welcome me as a complicated guest. Shay dismounted, shaking out her cramped legs. Dorne is far. We'd have to cross the Boneway or the Prince's Pass. That's a long, perilous journey, even if the Martells would protect us, Podrick ventured. Then maybe a ship from a southern port to Sunspear? That might be quicker. Tyrion grimaced. Any major port is likely crawling with watchers. Still, it may be our best shot. If I could speak directly with Prince Doran or Prince Oberyn, I might secure an alliance. Bronn smirked cynically. And if they decide you're more useful as a hostage, you'll be locked in some Dornish tower while they leverage your life against your father. A wry half-smile twisted Tyrion's lips. Yes, that's also a possibility. But at least they wouldn't hand me back to Tywin. If Oberyn's letters are any indication, the Martells are determined to see my father pay for Elaya's death. None of them had a better suggestion. The open road was too dangerous. Tyrion's presence made them targets for every mercenary who fancied gold in exchange for a dwarf's head. The more they lingered in the Crownlands, the greater the risk of capture by Tywin's men. It felt like the walls were closing in from all sides. At last, Tyrion rubbed his eyes, exhaustion weighing on him like a lead cloak. I need a moment to think. We can't keep wandering aimlessly. Shay and Podrick read the tension in his posture. They kept their silence, letting Tyrion wrestle with plans. Bronn, however, watched him with sharp eyes. You do that, Lannister, but you'd best decide soon, else we'll all be in shallow graves. They rode on until they found a small hollow hidden by thick shrubs. There, they tied the horses and attempted to rest for the remainder of the night. Tyrion dozed fitfully, heart pounding whenever he heard the slightest rustle. His mind reeled with images of the stable fight, the man's blood spraying across the straw. Was he a father, a brother? Another soul ground up in this endless dance of power. Dawn came with the shrill calls of distant crows. They shared a meager breakfast of stale bread. Once they were underway again, Tyrion found himself speaking softly to Pod and Shay, half to reassure them, half to hear his own thoughts. If we reach the Wendwater region, we might slip onto a lesser-known ferry crossing. Failing that, there are inlets along the coast where smugglers sometimes anchor. I might pay them to take us south. Pod nodded. Smugglers might ask a high price. Less than the price on my head, Tyrion retorted drily. We'll risk it. For 2 more days, they skirted farmland and minor roads. The land gradually changed, the rolling hills giving way to flatter terrain dotted with broadleaf trees. The climate warmed slightly, though the nights were still chilled by autumn's approach. On the morning of the 3rd day, they found a narrow track that seemed to lead toward the coast. The smell of salt drifted faintly in the air. Tyrion couldn't help but feel a cautious flicker of hope. If they could just secure passage on a ship, any ship, they might be beyond Tywin's immediate reach. Yet as they followed that path, they encountered sign after sign that something else was amiss. Smoke on the horizon, larger than a simple cook fire. A sense of tension in the scattered hamlets they passed. Villagers with drawn faces, whispering of roving soldiers who demanded to know if Tyrion Lannister had been seen. More men in the pay of Casterly Rock, no doubt. Tyrion felt certain that each day of travel brought them closer to either salvation or doom, and he could not guess which would arrive first. At midday, they came upon a crossroads where an old woman sat, weaving baskets. She eyed them warily, though she seemed too frail to run. Bronn asked her which way led to the nearest port. She cackled, revealing a mouth mostly devoid of teeth. That'd be up yonder, past the ridge, then down through the pines. But you'll find no ships there, I think. Heard tell they've all been hired or seized. We're brewing, so they say. Tyrion tensed. Who seized them? The old woman's eyes glinted. Crown's men, I reckon. Or men who claim to serve the crown. Folks say Lord Tywin wants no one of note leaving the shores. He's locking things down, as it were. A knot formed in Tyrion's belly. So Tywin was that desperate, to bar the coasts from letting Tyrion slip away. I see. Thank you, good lady. He tossed her a copper. She took it without gratitude, turning back to her weaving. They pressed on, though gloom settled over them. If the port was closed or heavily watched, they might be forced to consider an even smaller smuggler's cove. Or perhaps the old woman's rumor was exaggerated. Warlike measures often gave rise to half-truths, but given Tywin's cunning, it seemed entirely plausible. A grim quiet held them as the afternoon wore on. Eventually, they crested a low ridge, from which they glimpsed a wide bay in the distance. The sea shone under the sun, a brilliant swath of blue. Tyrion reined in. "Look there," he murmured, pointing. They could make out a smattering of ships anchored near a modest harbor. Tiny shapes moved on the docks, wagons or people, it was hard to tell. Bronn squinted. "No war galleys that I can see, but who knows how many men are on the piers. We might get lucky, or we might get pincushioned with crossbow bolts." Shay asked quietly, "What's our alternative? If Tywin blocks every harbor, we'll never leave." Tyrion pursed his lips. "We may have to try. If we see the situation is hopeless, we'll withdraw." With that uneasy resolution, they descended the ridge. The land sloped gently toward a brackish river that fed into the bay. Scrub pines lined the path, and the smell of salt grew stronger. Tyrion's heart thumped harder with each step. The sense of stepping into a viper's nest was nearly overwhelming, but he forced himself onward. At length, they drew close enough to see the harbor more clearly. It was a small port town ringed by a flimsy wooden wall, with a gate on the landward side. A few cogs and fishing boats bobbed at the docks, along with a single larger ship, perhaps a merchant carrack. Tyrion saw at least a dozen men in tabards patrolling. The tabards displayed the gold and red colors of the crown. Some of them had half-lion insignias, reminiscent of Lannister trappings, though not exact. Possibly the city watch or a local levy. They halted out of sight behind a rise. Tyrion studied the place, mind racing. He could attempt to bribe the dockworkers or the captain of that merchant ship, if they were inclined to defy the watchers. But with so many armed men strolling about, the risk was extreme. One slip and they'd be pinned. He turned to Bronn. "Thoughts?" Bronn rubbed his jaw. "We could wait until dusk, approach stealthily. Find the captain of that carrack, see if he'll take our coin." Tyrion nodded slowly. "Yes, if the watchers are under orders, they might be less vigilant at night. Or maybe they're more vigilant. But we can't just walk in broad daylight." Pod piped up. "We might pretend to be merchants. We have some coin left. We can claim we've come to arrange cargo." Tyrion chewed his lip. "It could work if we had less heat on us. But the moment they get a good look at me, or they see we're only 4 travelers with no real wares, they'll grow suspicious." Finally, they agreed to bide their time until nightfall. They found a secluded spot among a cluster of pines. The hours dragged painfully. Shay dozed fitfully. Bronn sharpened his dagger. Pod fed the horses a handful of oats. Tyrion pressed an ear to the ground now and again, straining to hear distant hoofbeats or marching boots. But the forest remained still. Dusk came in a wash of purplish light. Under cover of darkness, they tethered the horses in a thick patch of brush. If luck held, no one would stumble upon them. With only the moon to guide them, they picked their way toward the port on foot. Tyrion wore a hooded cloak that shrouded most of his features. Bronn led the way, moving with the caution of a cat. Podrick walked beside Shay, who carried a small satchel with what remained of their coin. The plan was that if confronted, Bronn would claim to be a caravan guard, guiding a merchant family. It was a flimsy pretense, but better than nothing. As they neared the wooden wall, they spotted 2 guards posted at the gate, burly men, leaning on spears. Their torches illuminated a few yards around them but left the rest of the area in deep shadow. Tyrion's pulse raced. Could they slip by unseen, or would they have to bribe or kill these guards? Killing would raise alarms. They hesitated. Bronn motioned them back into the darkness. Quietly, he pointed to a section of wall off to the side, where the wood looked old and partially rotted. If they could scale or pry it loose, they might enter the town without passing the gate. Tyrion gave a curt nod. They crept around, stepping as softly as possible. The wind off the bay caused the torches at the gate to flicker, making the guards glance about uneasily, but they didn't leave their posts. Reaching the section of wall Bronn indicated, they felt the boards. Indeed, some planks were loose. Bronn inserted his dagger, trying to pry an opening. The wood groaned, but with a little force, they managed to create a space large enough for someone of Shay's or Pod's size to slip through. Tyrion, being short, could also manage. Bronn might have to suck in his belly, but it seemed possible. Podrick went first, passing through with only a minor scrape. Then Shay. Tyrion followed, biting back a gasp as a nail snagged his cloak. He tugged free. Finally, Bronn squeezed through, cursing under his breath. They found themselves in a dark alley between two weathered buildings. The smell of fish guts hung heavy in the air. They paused, listening. No alarm was raised. No one was in the alley. Tyrion signaled for them to move deeper into the town, away from the gate. The buildings were close together, some with sagging roofs. At this hour, most windows were shuttered. Laughter and lamplight spilled from a single tavern down the way, but the rest of the street was deserted. A stray cat yowled as they crept along. They turned a corner onto a slightly wider lane that led toward the docks. Ahead, they glimpsed the silhouettes of several men near a cluster of fishing nets, presumably dockworkers or guards. Tyrion beckoned them into a narrow cross alley, huddling in the shadows. He peered around the corner, trying to gauge how best to reach the merchant ship. Its mast was visible beyond the pier, a faint lantern swaying on deck. Bronn whispered, "We'll have to approach the ship quietly. If they have a gangplank, we slip aboard if no one's watching. Or we find the captain and bribe him. But first we must get past those men at the nets." Tyrion nodded. "Let's see if there's another route, perhaps behind those warehouses." They tried to skirt around the rear of a storehouse that smelled of old salt and pitch. A plank fence blocked their way, so Bronn helped Shay and Pod climb over. Tyrion managed to scramble up a stack of crates, nearly losing his footing, until Bronn pulled him onto the fence top. They dropped down into a small enclosed yard. A dog started barking furiously, startling them all. Bronn hissed a curse. The dog, a wiry mutt, sprang toward them, teeth bared. Bronn raised his sword, but Tyrion grabbed his arm. "No, don't. That'll make a racket." Shay fumbled in the satchel, producing a piece of dried meat from their meager rations. She threw it toward the dog, who snapped it up but continued to growl. They retreated across the yard, pressing themselves against the far fence. The barking echoed, bound to draw attention. Sure enough, a door in the storehouse banged open. A man's voice echoed, "Who's there? Shut that bloody dog up." Light spilled into the yard. They froze out of sight for now, but pinned. The dog rushed toward the storehouse door, barking. The man stepped out, brandishing a lantern. "What's got into you?" He peered around. Tyrion's stomach lurched. If discovered, they were done for. Possibly this man was just a laborer, but any alarm raised would bring the guards. They inched along the fence, hearts hammering. Bronn pressed close to the wooden planks, tested them. If they could climb over quietly, the dog spun around, sniffing vigorously, as if catching a whiff of strangers. It bounded back across the yard. The man followed with the lantern, cursing. Tyrion met Bronn's eyes. "We have to move now." Bronn motioned to Podrick, who helped Shay up onto a crate next to the fence. She scrambled over the top, landing with a thump on the other side. Pod went next, then Tyrion. The dog saw them and redoubled its barking. The man with the lantern shouted, "Hey, thieves!" Bronn vaulted the fence last. They tumbled into another alley, got to their feet, and ran. Behind them, the dog's barking grew distant. They darted down a twisting path that opened onto the docks. Now they could see the merchant carrack more clearly. A two-masted ship, lamp swaying at the forecastle, the name Tyrosa's Wind scrawled on the hull. A few sailors milled about on the deck, likely finishing evening duties. Between them and the ship were half a dozen men in mismatched armor, clearly some sort of watch. One carried a torch, the others lingered in the gloom. Tyrion guessed these were local toughs in service to the crown, which now effectively meant Tywin's gold. Bronn exhaled in frustration. Too many to sneak by in a group. If we kill them, the entire harbor will know. That leaves bribery or a distraction. Tyrion looked around desperately. The storehouses, the line of fishing boats, the tide creeping in. A distraction. He spotted large nets hanging off a dockside crane, presumably laden with crates or barrels. If they could sabotage the crane, it might cause a ruckus. Podrick frowned. What if we start a fire? They'll rush to put it out. That might burn half the town, Tyrion whispered. We'd be no better than my father. Shae clutched Tyrion's sleeve. We need something quick. Bronn scanned the area and pointed. Look at that old piling at the far end of the dock. If I slip around and cut the rope securing that cargo, it'll drop in the water, maybe break open. That'll draw the watchers to investigate. Meanwhile, you three make for the gangplank. If the sailors ask questions, flash them coin. It's our best shot. Tyrion studied the distance between them and the plank. We'll have to move fast. Once the guards hear the crash, they'll probably run to see what happened. Or they might run straight at us if they suspect trickery. Bronn's eyes gleamed with confidence. Then move quickly and keep low. I'll find you on board if I can. They agreed on the plan. Splitting up, Bronn crept along the edge of the pier, sticking to shadows. Tyrion, Shae, and Pod hunkered down behind a stack of crates. From their vantage, they could see the men near the dock post, chatting idly. Now and then, one of them spat into the water. Tyrion's pulse drummed in his ears. Moments ticked by, each one a small eternity. Then came a sudden snap of rope, followed by a great crash of crates tumbling off the crane into the bay. With shattered, water splashed. The men jerked to attention. One shouted, "What in the seven hells?" They rushed over to the crane, torchlight bobbing. Tyrion gave a hoarse whisper, "Now!" They broke cover, hustling down the dock. The boards creaked ominously beneath their feet. Every second, Tyrion expected a guard to turn and raise the alarm. But the crash had drawn them all the other way. Within heartbeats, they reached the gangplank of the carrack. A single sailor stood near the top, fiddling with a coil of rope. He whirled at the sound of approaching footsteps. Podrick placed a frantic finger to his lips, urging silence. Shae quickly rummaged in her satchel and produced 3 gold coins. She held them out. The sailor's eyes flicked from the coins to Tyrion's hooded form. "What's this?" Tyrion pulled the hood back just enough to show his face. "Passage," he said quietly. "We need to speak to your captain." Discreetly, the sailor's eyes widened. "You're—" Tyrion seized the moment. Yes, I am. There's more gold if the captain can take us south. We'll pay triple your usual fare. But we must leave now." The man licked his lips nervously, glancing at the commotion on the dock. The others were still distracted. The splash had turned into an argument about who was responsible. "Captain's below," he finally said. "Go quickly. I'll watch for trouble." They wasted no time. Shae pressed the coins into his hand, and he motioned them aboard. Tyrion hurried over the plank, nearly stumbling on a loose board. Podrick followed, eyes darting. The deck was dimly lit by a single lantern. A pair of sailors emerged from the forecastle, confused, but the first man muttered something to them in a hushed tone, and they backed off, though they stared in curiosity at Tyrion's stature. Below decks, the air smelled of tar and stale sweat. A short corridor led to a cabin, from which a thin line of light spilled. Tyrion knocked softly, his breath ragged. Inside, a gravelly voice barked, "Who's that?" Tyrion pushed the door open. A middle-aged man with a trimmed beard, dressed in well-worn nautical attire, looked up from a small table scattered with charts. His eyes widened at the sight of Tyrion. "Gods preserve me. Is this some jest? Or are you actually Tyrion Lannister?" Tyrion stepped inside, Shae and Pod behind him. "Captain, I am indeed Tyrion of House Lannister. I have an urgent request. I need safe passage, and I can pay handsomely, but we must depart at once." The captain got to his feet, his expression guarded. You want me to smuggle you out of a port that's under watch by men loyal to your own father, if rumor holds true? Tyrion managed a weary smile. Such is my predicament. Name your price. The captain's gaze flicked to Shay and Pod, then back to Tyrion. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. I risk my ship, my crew, my livelihood. If you are truly who you say, I risk the wrath of the Lannister name. That's no small matter. Shay stepped forward, opened the pouch, and emptied a small fortune in gold and silver onto the table. It was not quite everything Tyrion possessed, but it was enough to dazzle most men. The captain's eyes gleamed with sudden avarice. That's a start, he said. You'll pay more when we land. Tyrion's mouth felt dry. He nodded. Agreed, but we must sail tonight. We can't tarry until dawn. The captain rubbed his chin, then sat back down. We were set to sail on the morning tide anyway, carrying cargo to Duskendale first, then possibly onward. But if you pay me, we can skip Duskendale and head straight for, say, Maidenpool or Driftmark, or even further. Tyrion shook his head. I need to go south, to Dorne ideally. If you can take me part of the way, perhaps near the Broken Arm or the Dornish coast, I'll see you rewarded. The captain grimaced. Dorne is well out of my usual route, but for the right coin, he trailed off, a slow smile forming. We'll have to avoid the royal ships. They'll want to inspect any vessel leaving port. That means slipping out in the dark. No lanterns. Whatever it takes, Tyrion said. But there's one more friend who needs to come aboard. He's on the docks, creating our distraction. At that moment, a commotion sounded above. Heavy footsteps, raised voices. Tyrion tensed, fearing the watchers had discovered them. The captain stiffened, placing a hand on a short sword that lay across the bed. Pod grabbed his wooden club, though his face was pale. Shay hovered at Tyrion's side. Then a voice drifted down from on deck. All's well, Captain. Just a friend coming aboard. More footsteps. A heartbeat later, Bronn appeared in the cabin, breathing hard, a grin tugging at his lips. Nearly got spotted, he said. But I think we're in the clear for now. He looked at the gold on the table and whistled. That's a tidy sum. The captain nodded curtly to Bronn. So it's 5 of you then? 4, Tyrion corrected. Including me. Shay, Podrick, Bronn, and... Well, I suppose you'll want to bring your own men. The captain's brow furrowed. We'll sail with a skeleton crew if needed. Less chance of loose tongues. But I'll want a bonus for each man who keeps quiet. He extended his palm. 3 more gold dragons, at least. Tyrion sighed, rummaging in the pouch. You drive a hard bargain, but fine. He dropped the coins into the captain's calloused hand, hearing the faint rattle that might decide their fate. Now, let's weigh anchor before our luck runs out. The captain barked orders. Within minutes, men scrambled on deck, hauling lines, hoisting sails by moonlight. Torches were doused to avoid drawing attention. Tyrion and his companions stayed below, cramped in the small cabin, hearts racing. A low rumble of confusion drifted from the docks, but the watchers were apparently still diverted. Soon, Tyrion felt the gentle swaying of the ship as it was pushed off the wharf. A creak of timbers, a splash of water against the hull. They were moving. In the darkness of the cramped cabin, Tyrion finally allowed himself to breathe. Shay sank to the floor, trembling from relief. Podrick gazed at Tyrion as if he couldn't quite believe they had succeeded. Bronn looked faintly amused by all the drama. They drifted out into the bay with minimal noise. Every squeal of rope made Tyrion's heart skip, but no alarm was raised. The ship's sails caught a gentle breeze, carrying them away from the flickering lights of the port. Once they were a safe distance out, the captain rapped on the cabin door. We're clear, he said softly. God's willing, no one's the wiser. We'll keep off the main lanes, but I can't promise we won't meet a patrol. If we do, and they demand to board, I expect you to hide. Tyrion swallowed. Agreed. The captain eyed him. Dorne, is it? I'll need to chart a new course. We'll likely skirt the coast, maybe stopping for fresh water here or there. But if the watchers at sea become suspicious, "I know," Tyrion cut in. "We appreciate your risk. You'll be paid." The captain nodded once, then withdrew to oversee his crew. Tyrion sat, half collapsing onto the small bunk. "We did it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We're out." Shay knelt beside him, her face a swirl of emotions. She took his hand. "We're safe for now." Podrick sank onto a wooden chest, still wide-eyed. "Lord Tyrion, what happens if your father's men catch us at sea?" Tyrion managed a wan smile. "We pray they don't, and if they do, we improvise." Bronn stood near the door, arms folded. "I prefer to do more than pray, Lannister. We should keep our weapons ready." "Agreed." Tyrion leaned his head back against the bulkhead, exhaustion rolling through him in waves. He had scarcely slept in days, always running, always looking over his shoulder. At last, the gentle rocking of the ship lulled him into a semblance of calm. They slipped further from shore, each minute carrying them away from Tywin's immediate reach. Yet Tyrion knew his father's influence was not confined to the Crownlands. A Lannister always found ways to kill from afar. Still, for this moment, Tyrion allowed himself to feel relief. He had escaped King's Landing. His revelations had shattered Tywin's reputation, set the realm ablaze with outrage, and forced Tyrion into exile. Where it would all lead, only the gods could say. Before drifting into a shaky sleep, he reminded himself, House Lannister's credibility was broken, but Tywin yet lived. If that old lion could not restore his iron grip, the entire structure of Westeros might shift. The Tyrells, the Martells, the Faith, the Iron Bank, all contending with or against the Lannisters. The war might reignite, or the realm might see a glimmer of justice. Tyrion could only hope that, in the end, he had done more good than harm. He clung to that hope the way a drowning man clutches driftwood. When he opened his eyes again, a faint gray light filtered through the tiny porthole, heralding dawn. The carrack swayed gently, and the smell of salt air crept into the cabin. Shay and Podrick were asleep on a pallet of blankets. Bronn was gone, likely on deck, scanning the horizon. Tyrion rose, grimacing at the ache in his joints. He eased out of the cabin. Above, a brisk sea breeze ruffled his hair. Sailors moved about their tasks with quiet efficiency, some casting curious glances at the dwarf in their midst. The captain stood near the wheel, conferring with a mate about wind direction. Bronn leaned on the rail, gazing at the vast expanse of water. Tyrion joined him, resting his arms on the rail, feeling the spray on his face. The coastline of the Crownlands lay a distant blur behind them. They seemed to be heading southeast. He saw no sails on the horizon that might indicate pursuit. Still, tension coiled in his gut. Bronn tilted his head in greeting. "Enjoying the fresh air, Lannister?" "Trying to," Tyrion replied. "I keep imagining war galleys popping out from behind every wave." Bronn barked a short laugh. "If that happens, it'll be too late to fret. But for now, the sea is empty." He gestured to the watery nothingness ahead. "We have days of sailing yet. Plenty of time for you to mull over how you plan to approach Dorne." That was the crux of it. Even if they reached the Dornish coast, Tyrion would have to petition House Martell for sanctuary. Prince Oberyn had assured him in letters that if Tyrion provided proof of Tywin's crimes, Dorne would see him as a valuable witness in seeking justice for Elia. But with the realm in upheaval, Oberyn might decide to use Tyrion as a pawn. Or worse, Prince Doran might outmaneuver them all. "I suppose I'll cross that bridge when I arrive," Tyrion said wryly. "What about you, Bronn? You could have slipped away at any time. Why stick with me?" Bronn shrugged, gazing out at the water. "You pay well, and I like a good scrap. Besides, I figure if Tywin goes down, there'll be a shift in the balance of power. That means opportunities. No sense scuttling off when I can ride the wave to something better." Tyrion recognized that Bronn's brand of loyalty was about coin and advantage, but that was more reliable than empty honor sometimes. He glanced at the sails, filled with a decent wind. "Let's hope you're not disappointed, then." They stood in silence for a time, watching the gulls circle overhead. Tyrion reflected on the swirl of events. From the red keep to the scuffle in the stable, from bounty hunters on the roads to bribing the captain of this carrack. It was as though he'd lived a lifetime in a few short weeks. All the while, the realm churned with the revelations about Tywin's monstrous deeds. Tyrion wondered how the small folk fared now. Would the city starve without Tyrell grain? Would rebellions flare in the Westerlands? Would Cersei cling to whatever power she could grasp? A flicker of guilt wormed its way into Tyrion's chest. By exposing Tywin, he might have consigned thousands to fresh chaos. Yet the alternative was to let those crimes remain hidden. He had chosen to believe in the possibility of justice. If that justice bore a heavy price, was it still worth paying? He believed so, yet the question gnawed at him. Eventually, the captain approached. "We'll keep our heading for a day or two," he said gruffly. "Then we must resupply, unless you wish us all to starve. Nearest friendly port is not so far from Duskendale, ironically, but we can't venture near there if you're aboard." Tyrion nodded. "Understood. Is there a cove or a less guarded settlement we might slip into?" The captain scratched his beard. "There's a fishing village or two along Crackclaw Point. The folks there are a superstitious lot, but for coin they might give us fresh water and some salt fish. Then we can sail on to Maidenpool or continue south." "Let's do that, then. The fewer prying eyes, the better." So it was decided. The next 2 days at sea passed in relative calm, giving Tyrion a chance to rest and gather his wits. Shay seemed to regain some of her usual levity, though a nervous tension lingered beneath her smiles. Podrick adapted surprisingly well, helping the sailors with small chores. Bronn spent most of his time gambling with the crew, no doubt cheating them out of a few silver pieces. Tyrion kept mostly to the stern, thinking, planning, occasionally offering a coin to the cook for a share of better rations. On the afternoon of the second day, the wind shifted, driving them eastward. By dusk, the captain dropped anchor near a secluded inlet along Crackclaw Point, a jagged stretch of coastline known for its bogs and half-forgotten keeps. They had not seen any war galleys or suspicious ships, which Tyrion counted a blessing. That night, the crew lowered a small boat to row ashore in search of water and fresh supplies. Bronn and Podrick went along, leaving Tyrion and Shay aboard. As Tyrion paced the deck, the moonlight illuminated the black water. Shay joined him, slipping an arm through his. "I don't like this place," she said softly. "It feels eerie." Tyrion glanced at the distant treeline. Crackclaw Point was reputedly home to hidden enclaves of stubborn folk who considered themselves independent of the great houses. "We'll depart soon enough," he assured her. "Once we have fresh stores, we'll continue south." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "My lion, do you think we'll ever be safe again?" He sighed. "I wish I could promise you that. For now, we survive day to day. If we can reach Dorne, perhaps we'll find a measure of safety in Oberyn's goodwill. Or we can cross the narrow sea altogether, hide away in Essos." She was quiet a long moment, then whispered, "I'd follow you no matter which side of the sea. Just don't die on me." A bittersweet smile curved his lips. "I'll do my best." They lingered in companionable silence. Tyrion's mind drifted to Jaime, to the High Septon's push for an inquest, to the hungry eyes of the small folk in Flea Bottom. He imagined the red keep echoing with the sound of courtiers turning on Tywin, or the city's walls plastered with seditious proclamations. Perhaps seeds of rebellion were already sprouting across the Crownlands. House Tyrell might soon tighten its stranglehold on grain shipments, forcing Tywin to yield or face mass starvation. Dorne's calls for justice would only grow louder. At length, the rowboat returned, loaded with barrels of water, salted fish, and a few bags of hard bread. Bronn leapt aboard, his grin visible even in the dim light. "No trouble from the locals," he reported. "They're a surly bunch, but they took coin without questions." The captain supervised hauling the supplies aboard. Podrick stumbled off the rowboat, nearly dropping a barrel. "We're well provisioned now," he said to Tyrion, eyes shining with relief. "So we can keep going, right?" Tyrion patted his shoulder. "Aye, let's not linger any longer than necessary." True to plan, the carrack weighed anchor as soon as the supplies were stowed. The tide was in their favor, the sails catching a decent breeze from the north. The water lapped at the hull in a steady rhythm. Tyrion felt a stirring of cautious optimism. Each league brought them closer to freedom from Tywin's immediate grip. That night, Tyrion climbed into the hammock in the captain's cabin, letting the gentle sway lull him. He drifted in and out of slumber, haunted by half-formed dreams of gold lion banners burning in a black wind. Once, he thought he heard bells ringing, as if King's Landing were under siege. Another time, he imagined Oberyn's voice saying, "You have done well, imp," only to see the red viper's face contort into a snarl of vengeance. Morning dawned gray, with patchy clouds overhead. The ship cut through the waves, leaving Cracklaw Point behind. The captain aimed to pass south of Dragonstone, an island that might or might not be friendly. No one was certain who truly held it now, after the War of the Five Kings. The days of Stannis Baratheon seemed so distant, yet the echoes of that conflict lingered everywhere. As they neared the waters off Dragonstone, tension aboard grew. Some of the sailors cast nervous glances at the volcanic island. Rumor claimed dragons had once roosted there, that ghosts of Targaryens haunted the fortress. Tyrion had been to Dragonstone before, but in different times under different banners. Now it was just another risk in a sea of dangers. Bronn leaned on the railing, scanning the horizon. "I see no war galleys," he muttered. "Just a few fishing sloops. We might pass by unremarked." And so they did for the most part. A few small boats steered clear of the larger carrack. The castle of Dragonstone loomed on the craggy shore, dark and foreboding against the sky. No watch vessel came out to challenge them. Tyrion felt an odd pang of relief laced with disappointment. Part of him half expected something dramatic, as if the gods themselves would intervene. But the gods often turned a blind eye to men's doings. Once they were safely past Dragonstone, the mood aboard lightened. Even the captain allowed himself a wry joke about King's Landing. "Heard the capital's in dire shape," he said, spitting into the sea. "Starvation, riots, calls for Tywin's head. Good riddance, I say." Tyrion offered a grim smile. "Yes, but many innocents will suffer." Well, the realm has always used the small folk as fodder." The captain shrugged, turning back to the rigging. They continued southward over the next few days, sometimes glimpsing the coast, other times sailing farther offshore to avoid potential patrols. The weather held steady, though occasional squalls tested the crew's skill. Each dawn, Tyrion awoke uncertain whether they'd be boarded or attacked by some Crown-allied ship. But so far, the sea remained quiet. At night, Tyrion would wander the deck, looking out at the moonlit waters. Shay often joined him, leaning into him for warmth against the sea breeze. He would wonder if Jaime was still in King's Landing, whether the High Septon had forced Tywin into any public reckoning, or if Cersei had unleashed her venom on the small folk to quell riots. He pictured the commoners chanting for the downfall of the Lannisters, fueled by rumors of atrocities. And somewhere in the Red Keep, Tywin would be tightening his grip on power, or losing it inch by inch. One dawn, about a fortnight since their escape from that port, the lookout shouted that he saw a fleet on the horizon. 4 or 5 ships flying some banner. Alarm spread among the crew. Tyrion scrambled up on deck, heart pounding, expecting the worst. But as the sails drew closer, the mate recognized the banner. A green and white triple spiral. An Arbor fleet, perhaps, or merchants from the Reach. If so, they were unlikely to be searching for fugitives. The captain steered wide, and the fleet did not alter course. Soon enough, the strange vessels receded into the distance. Relief washed over everyone. The next morning, a seagull soared overhead, signaling they neared warmer waters. Tyrion tested the breeze. It felt less chill, a promise of southern climes. Perhaps the storms of the Crownlands were behind them. Another week at sea, the captain predicted, and they might edge the coast near the Broken Arm, where Dornish territory began. On the 18th day, they spied the hazy outline of a new landmass. The captain, after consulting his charts, declared it was likely the coast near the Rainwood, the southern reaches of the Stormlands. "We can sail further south," But we might need fresh water again, he warned Tyrion. There's a cove ahead. If we land briefly at night, we can refill our barrels from a stream. Tyrion agreed. They angled toward a small bay. Evening shadows stretched across the water, and the carrack maneuvered behind a rocky outcrop to avoid prying eyes. A few men lowered the rowing boat, preparing the barrels. Tyrion decided it might be safer if he, Shay, Pod, and Bronn stayed aboard. Too many people going ashore could invite attention. The rowers departed, leaving the ship in a hush. Darkness settled, broken only by starlight. Tyrion paced the deck, uneasy. Something felt off. The coastline here was dense with forest, perfect for an ambush. The captain claimed the area was lightly inhabited, but that did not guarantee safety. Suddenly, a light flickered in the trees, then vanished. Tyrion froze, straining his eyes. Bronn saw it too. "Someone's there," Bronn muttered, hand drifting to his sword. Another flicker, then the distinct glow of a torch or lantern. A shape emerged along the shoreline, perhaps 200 yards away. More lights bobbed behind it. Tyrion's pulse kicked up. If that was a patrol, they might spot the rowboat or the ship. Sure enough, shouts echoed faintly over the water. Torchlight multiplied in the treeline. Men began streaming onto the beach. Tyrion cursed under his breath. Are those Tywin's men, or stormlords, or bandits? Bronn squinted. Hard to say, but they look organized. Possibly soldiers. Podrick, eyes wide, edged closer. Should we weigh anchor and leave the rowers behind? Tyrion clenched his jaw. That would mean abandoning the sailors who had gone for water. He wasn't heartless, but if the ship stayed, they could all be caught. We can't just sail away. The captain's among them, yes. Shay nodded, worry etched on her features. He might be captured or killed if those are soldiers. Bronn let out a low grunt of frustration. We'll not stand a chance if we try to rescue them on that beach. We're outnumbered. Torchlight on shore grew brighter. Tyrion saw silhouettes pointing toward the rowboat. Then a cry carried over the water, perhaps the voice of the captain. A clash of steel followed. Tyrion's heart sank. This was exactly the sort of disaster he feared. Meanwhile, the few crewmen left aboard milled about in confusion, looking to Tyrion for direction. He had effectively become the source of coin, though he held no official rank. They whispered among themselves. If the captain was captured, who would command the ship? Bronn clenched his fists. We either flee or fight. If they have archers, they could pick us off as we approach. We've only a handful of men here. Tyrion cursed Tywin, the gods, and his own ill luck. Damn it all. If we do nothing, the rowers might be tortured into revealing who's aboard. Those men might come for us next. Shay tugged at his sleeve. But you're not equipped to stage a battle on the beach. Pod licked his lips. We could sail closer, use the ship's crossbows. Do we have crossbows? The mate, a wiry sailor with an old scar, spoke up. We have 2 mounted crossbows on deck, but only a handful of bolts. Might scare them off or kill a few. Tyrion weighed the options. All right, he said at last, steeling himself. We'll move in, fire a volley or 2. Maybe that'll give our men a chance to retreat to the boat. If it looks impossible, we cut our losses. The mate nodded curtly, rushing to ready the crossbows. Bronn helped him pivot one of the devices so it pointed starboard, toward shore. Podrick fetched the bolts from a chest below deck. Shay gripped Tyrion's arm, her knuckles white. Please, be careful. The carrack's remaining sailors raised the anchor with frantic haste, letting the current push them nearer the beach. As they drew within a few hundred feet, Tyrion could see torches bobbing erratically, flickers of men engaged in a struggle. Some of the rowers might already be dead or wounded. He swallowed his fear. Loose! The mate cried, and the first crossbow fired. The heavy bolt whistled through the night, striking the sand near the cluster of men. A second bolt followed, landing closer, forcing the attackers to scatter. Some torches fell or were extinguished. A ragged shout went up from the beach. Hold them off! Tyrion shouted, though he felt absurd giving orders in a battle. Keep firing until we see who's left of our crew. Bronn aimed the second crossbow and fired. Another distant scream. The watchers on the beach realized they were under attack from the ship. A few retreated behind rocks or retreated into the treeline. Tyrion spotted figures sprinting along the sand. One of them looked like the captain, stumbling but alive. Another might have been one of the rowers. "Boats there by the shallows," Pod said, pointing. Indeed, the rowboat was overturned or half-dragged on shore. The men who survived the ambush were trying to push it back into the water. "Cover them," Tyrion barked. Bronn reloaded with Pod's help and fired again, this time hitting a man who had been lunging toward the rowers. The man fell with a cry. The rowers managed to flip the boat upright. Tyrion held his breath. If they could push off, they might reach the carrack. Then a volley of arrows arced out of the darkness, hissing overhead. One struck the ship's hull with a dull thunk, another lodged in the mast, and a third sailed past Tyrion's ear. He ducked, heart pounding. "Take cover!" The mate reloaded and fired the crossbow again, blind into the dark treeline. He must have hit someone, for they heard a faint scream. Another arrow flew, grazing a sailor's leg. Chaos reigned. Tyrion dared a look. The rowers were shoving off, 2 men in the boat, the captain leaning over the side as though injured. They drifted into the shallows, struggling to row. "Bring her about," Tyrion shouted to the sailors controlling the sails. "So we can pull them aboard." They maneuvered closer, relying on the cover of darkness to hamper the archer's aim. Another arrow plunked into the water just short of the ship. Tyrion's hands shook. If the rowboat didn't reach them soon, the next volley could kill them all. Then, mercifully, the small boat drew alongside the carrack, and Bronn helped hoist the wounded men up. An arrow streaked past, narrowly missing one of the rowers. A final crossbow bolt from the mate forced the remaining attackers to retreat further. The rowboat bobbed away, half sunk, but they had their men. "Hoist the sails," Tyrion cried. "Get us out of range." The ship heaved as the sails caught the wind. Slowly, laboriously, they inched away from the shoreline. Arrows continued to pepper the water, but with less frequency. Likely the archers couldn't see well in the gloom. After a few more tense moments, they were out of range entirely, the torches on the beach shrinking behind them. Tyrion hurried to the captain's side, where Shay and Pod were helping to lay him down. A bloody slash marred the captain's side, though it didn't look immediately fatal. He coughed, wincing. "Bastards. Ambushed us, soldiers, I think," he rasped. "Wore no banners, but they were disciplined." Tyrion pressed a cloth to the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Were they looking for me?" The captain spat out blood. "They demanded to know what business we had. Might have recognized the ship from some report. Or they're just out to kill or capture travelers. Not sure." 2 of the rowers lay dead or dying. The survivors wept or stared blankly. One was missing a hand. Tyrion felt bile rise in his throat. This was the cost of traveling with him. He helped the wounded as best he could, telling Shay to fetch water and clean bandages. Pod hovered, wide-eyed with shock. Bronn stood guard near the rail, crossbow in hand, scanning the coastline for any sign of pursuit. Once the immediate crisis passed, Tyrion sagged against a crate. The smell of blood and salt churned his stomach. The captain stared at him with dimming eyes. "We lost good men," he said, voice tight. "Next time we keep well away from the coast. If that means we run short on supplies." Tyrion bowed his head. "I'm sorry. I never wanted your men to die." The captain's gaze was hard. "Yes, well, you pay me and I do the job. But let's be clear. If we face more ambushes, I may decide the coin's not worth the risk." "Understood." Tyrion nodded. "Understood." They sailed on through the night, leaving the rainwood behind. Morale was low, the entire crew sullen and fearful. Tyrion overheard mutterings that they should throw him overboard to rid themselves of this cursed voyage. He resolved to keep his head down, do what he could to aid the wounded, and hope that once they reached Dorne, all might find some measure of relief. Yet sleep eluded him, haunted by the knowledge that more blood had been spilled on his account. He had done the right thing, exposing Tywin's crimes, but the realm's response was madness. Perhaps it was always madness, lurking beneath the surface. As he leaned against the rocking hull, the last anchor of calm he had was the faint sense that, for better or worse, the truth was out there, coursing through the seven kingdoms like a wildfire no one could extinguish. South they went, day by day, battered by storms and frayed nerves. At last, they came within sight of the Dornish coast. A searing sun beat down, the air growing warmer with each league. The great rocky promontories of the Broken Arm loomed. It felt like stepping into another world, with pale desert cliffs rising from the sea. Tyrion and the captain conferred, deciding to aim for a small cove near the Greenblood River mouth, from which they might travel inland to Sunspear or a lesser Martell-held port. On a sweltering afternoon, the Carrack anchored off a sheltered inlet. Tyrion peered at the coastline through a spyglass borrowed from the mate. He saw no warships. A handful of fishing skiffs dotted the distant shallows. The land rose behind them, a sun-baked slope of sand and red stone. The captain approached, his wound bound but still paining him. "This is as far as I go, Lannister. We'll lower a boat, you and your folk can row ashore. There's a fishing village 2 or 3 miles inland, by the mouth of the Greenblood. From there, you can hire transport or find your Martell friends, if they truly exist." Tyrion nodded. "Thank you. I'll pay you the rest of what we agreed." The captain's mouth tightened. "You cost me good men, but gold is gold. I'll drop anchor here for a day to make sure you aren't recaptured at sea. After that, I'm gone." Tyrion couldn't blame him. He fetched the remaining coin from his pouch, along with a small ring set with a garnet. "Here, the ring, too, for the families of the dead." The captain accepted it with a grim nod. "Safe journey, dwarf." Bronn, Shay, and Podrick joined Tyrion in the rowboat. A single sailor volunteered to help row them ashore. The bright Dornish sun reflected off the water, making them squint. The boat creaked as it cut through the gentle swells. Seabirds screeched overhead. Each of them felt the press of a new uncertainty. Dorne was alien to all but Tyrion, who had read countless books about its history, but never truly explored its deserts. When they finally beached on the sandy shore, they hauled the boat clear of the surf. Tyrion gazed around, heart pounding with a mix of relief and trepidation. They were far from King's Landing, from Tywin's grasp, but also far from any guaranteed safety, save for the tenuous hope that Oberyn Martell would honor his word. The sailor gave them a curt farewell, returning to the boat. Soon, the gentle scrape of oars faded, leaving Tyrion and his companions on a wide, lonely expanse of sand. The sun beat down mercilessly, the heat unlike the cooler climes up north. Podrick shielded his eyes, scanning for any sign of a path. Bronn let out a low whistle. "Well, we made it. Now what?" Tyrion dusted off his hands. "We head inland, find that fishing village the captain mentioned. From there, we inquire if the Martells have any men near. We present ourselves cautiously. Dorne is no friend to my father, but that doesn't make them immediate friends to me." Shay took his arm. "We'll be careful, my lion." He nodded, gazing across the shimmering dunes. "Yes, one step at a time." Thus they began their trek, the 4 of them trudging under the unrelenting sun. Whatever lay ahead, reprisal, alliance, or betrayal, Tyrion would face it knowing that he had torn down Tywin Lannister's mask and exposed the monstrous truth beneath. The realm might descend into new storms of blood and fire, but it would do so without the illusion that men like Tywin were merely dutiful patriots. In time, perhaps, there would be a reckoning. The dead, Elia Martell and her children, the slaughtered villagers of the Riverlands, nameless peasants who died in secret atrocities, deserved as much. Tyrion wondered if he would live to see it, or if he'd become just another casualty in the swirling chaos. But for now, he trudged through shifting Dornish sands, forging onward into a land scorched by sun and vengeance, carrying with him the fragile hope that truth might yet kindle a better dawn for Westeros, or at the very least, bring final justice to Tywin Lannister, the once untouchable lion brought to bay by the son he had always despised. And so the dwarf pressed on, each footstep a promise that he would not abandon the fight he had begun, come what may.